There are ancient mummies in China that look like any other human remains we have studied. Their bodies, their clothing, even their faces suggest they belong somewhere within the known story of human history. But when their DNA was analysed, it did not clearly match any known population, past or present. This creates a quiet problem. We assume every human group can be traced, that every population connects to a larger genetic path across time. Yet here, that connection becomes unclear. If all humans come from shared origins, then how can a group appear to stand outside those patterns? And how could these ancient mummies in China have DNA that does not clearly match any known population? In the western regions of what is now China, there is a vast stretch of land where the ground appears still and unchanging, shaped more by wind than by water. This area, often associated with the Tarim Basin, is surrounded by mountains that limit movement and isolate what lies within. At first glance, it does not seem like a place where many human stories would remain visible for long. The dryness is constant, the temperature shifts are wide, and the soil itself offers little comfort to anything that tries to grow or settle. Yet it is precisely this harshness that has allowed certain traces of the past to remain unusually clear, almost as if time slowed down rather than moved forward. Among these traces are human bodies, preserved not by deliberate intention, but by the quiet conditions of the environment. They are often referred to as the Tarim mummies, although that name can suggest a level of certainty that the evidence itself does not always support. When these bodies were first uncovered, they did not immediately create a sense of mystery. They were, in a basic sense, human remains, shaped by the same anatomy that connects all people. Their presence alone did not contradict anything we already understood about the past. What made them different emerged more slowly, through careful observation rather than sudden discovery. The preservation itself was one of the first details to stand out. In many parts of the world, organic material breaks down quickly, leaving only bones behind. But here, the dryness of the air and the chemistry of the soil reduced the activity of bacteria, allowing skin, hair, and even clothing to remain intact over long periods. This created a situation where the past was not just inferred, but partially visible. Faces could still be seen, textiles could still be examined. Small details that are usually lost became part of the evidence. This kind of preservation changes how we approach history. Instead of reconstructing a life from fragments, we are confronted with something closer to a complete form, though still silent and without direct explanation. The environment, in this sense, becomes part of the story. It does not just host the remain, it actively shapes what survives and what does not. In regions with more moisture, the same individuals would likely have left behind far less information. Here, the land itself holds the record in a different way, not by adding detail, but by preventing its loss. As more of these bodies were found across the basin, a pattern began to form, not in the sense of a clear conclusion, but in the repetition of similar conditions. The burials were often simple, and the objects placed with the bodies did not immediately indicate a single unified culture that could be easily named. Instead, they suggested a population that lived within this environment over time, adapting to its limits and possibilities. The scale of these findings did not come from a single discovery, but from multiple sites spread across a wide area, each adding another piece without fully completing the picture. What we see at this stage is not a solved question, but the beginning of one. The bodies exist. The environment explains their preservation. The archaeological context provides fragments of daily life. But none of these elements, on their own, explain how these people fit into the broader movement of human populations. At this early point, the story remains grounded in what can be directly observed: a dry landscape, a series of preserved individuals, and the gradual recognition that something about their presence may not align easily with existing expectations. It is a slow realization not driven by a single surprising detail, but by the accumulation of small observations that do not fully settle into place. As more sites within the basin were gradually examined, the presence of these preserved individuals began to feel less like an isolated occurrence, and more like a recurring pattern that required careful attention. The discoveries did not emerge all at once, but over time, often through routine archaeological work rather than dramatic events. Each new burial site added another layer of detail, not by providing clear answers, but by extending the same quiet uncertainty. The bodies were positioned in ways that suggested intention, yet the structure of these burials did not always align neatly with well-documented traditions from surrounding regions. This created a situation where observation could move forward, but classification remained cautious. The land itself, stretching across the Taklamakan Desert, continued to play a central role in shaping what could be known. Its dryness did not simply preserve individual bodies, but entire burial contexts, allowing objects made from organic materials to survive alongside them. Wooden structures, fragments of woven fabric, and traces of plant material could all remain visible in a way that would be unlikely in more humid environments. This meant that the archaeological record here was unusually rich in certain kinds of detail, while still limited in others. The absence of written records, for example, left interpretation dependent on physical evidence alone. One of the more subtle shifts in understanding came from the repetition of similar burial features across different locations. While no single site provided a complete cultural picture, the accumulation of sites began to suggest continuity over time. This did not necessarily indicate a single, unified group, but it did point toward a population that had developed ways of living and dying within this environment. The materials used, the positioning of the bodies, and the selection of burial goods all hinted at patterns, though these patterns were not always consistent enough to form a clear cultural identity. In many cases, the differences between sites were just as noticeable as the similarities. This is where the question begins to deepen. In regions where human populations are well connected, we often see strong links between burial practices, material culture, and known historical groups. Here, those links remained less defined. The objects found with the bodies did not clearly match a single neighbouring culture, nor did they fully resemble what might be expected from distant regions. Instead, they occupied a space that felt intermediate, shaped by local conditions but not easily traced to a specific origin. This does not imply that these people were separate from the broader human story, but it does suggest that their position within that story is not immediately visible through surface evidence alone. Over time, the process of excavation and documentation became more systematic. Researchers began to map the locations of these sites, compare materials across different burials, and establish relative timelines based on available dating methods. These efforts did not produce a single narrative, but they did narrow the range of possibilities. Certain assumptions could be set aside, while others gained tentative support. Still, the central issue remained unchanged. The evidence described a population that lived in this region for extended periods, yet its connections to other known populations were not clearly defined through the usual archaeological indicators. At this stage, the story is still grounded in physical context rather than biological explanation. The land preserves the bodies, the burials reveal patterns, and the artifacts provide glimpses of daily life. But the larger question, how these people relate to the wider movement of human populations, remains open. The sense of something not fully aligning does not come from a single contradiction, but from the way each piece of evidence adds detail without fully resolving the broader picture. The first impression created by these mummies was not only scientific, it was also visual, and that made the discoveries unusually powerful. In most archaeological settings, the dead arrive to us as bone, soil, stone, or broken objects. The human being has almost disappeared, and the mind must rebuild what is missing. In the dry basin of western China, the situation was different. The preserved bodies still carried traces that felt close to life. Hair that had not vanished, faces that still held recognizable form, garments that showed the work of human hands. This did not make them mysterious in a supernatural sense. It made them difficult to ignore. They were not just remains from a distant age. They were evidence with a human surface still attached to it. That surface created a strong temptation to explain them too quickly. When a face is visible, people naturally want to place it into a familiar category. When clothing survives, people want to connect it to a known culture. When a body appears different from what is expected in a certain region, people may rush towards simple labels. But careful history cannot move that way. A preserved face is not a complete origin story. A textile is not a full migration map. A burial style is not, by itself, proof of ancestry. The earliest importance of these mummies lies in the tension between what seems visible and what remains unknown. They appear unusually clear, yet their meaning is not clear at all. This is the first quiet lesson of the discovery. The past can sometimes look more complete than it really is. The desert protected details that would normally have disappeared, but preservation does not automatically create certainty. It can even create a different kind of uncertainty, because it gives us more to look at before we fully understand how the pieces connect. The bodies show that people lived, worked, died, and were buried in this region. The objects around them suggest practical choices shaped by climate, material availability, and social customs. The landscape suggests a world where movement was possible but not easy, where mountains, deserts, and oases shaped the routes people could take. All of this matters because the central question is not only about the bodies themselves. It is about how a human group can appear in a place where the usual lines of explanation do not immediately settle into place. Before DNA entered the story, the uncertainty was already there, resting quietly in the archaeological record. The mummies did not simply ask who these people were. They asked how much we can know from appearance, burial, and location alone. In human history, populations rarely fit into clean, modern boxes. People move, mix, separate, and disappear over long stretches of time. Some groups leave descendants who are easy to trace. Others leave only faint signals, preserved in objects, bones, or fragments of genetic material. The people represented by these mummies may have belonged to a world of movement and isolation that does not match the political and ethnic boundaries we use today. That is why the discovery must begin slowly. It must begin with the place, the bodies, the burials, and the limits of what each kind of evidence can tell us. If we begin with a conclusion, we risk turning a real scientific puzzle into a false certainty. But if we begin with the evidence, the question becomes more useful and more honest. These ancient mummies in China matter because they remind us that human history is not always a straight line. Sometimes it is a pattern of traces left in difficult places, where the land preserves enough to make us look closely, but not enough to let us answer too soon. The first stage of the story, then, is not discovery as solution, it is discovery as disturbance, a set of preserved human lives that quietly interrupt the map we thought was already becoming complete. Before any deeper question about origin or identity can be approached, there is a more immediate question that shapes everything else. Why are these bodies still here in such detail at all? In most regions where humans have lived, the physical traces of the body disappear quickly. Moisture allows bacteria to break down soft tissue, temperature changes accelerate decay, and over time, only fragments of bone remain. This is why much of human history must be reconstructed from incomplete remains. But in parts of the Tarim Basin, the environment does not follow this usual pattern. Instead of encouraging decay, it quietly slows it down. The air is extremely dry for much of the year, and the ground contains salts that limit microbial activity. Together, these conditions create a space where organic material does not vanish at the expected rate. This does not mean that time stops. It means that time moves differently, preserving some details while still altering others. The bodies found in this region were not preserved through intentional embalming, as seen in other parts of the world. There is no consistent evidence of chemical treatment or deliberate internal preparation. What occurred here is closer to natural desiccation. As moisture leaves the body rapidly after death, the conditions necessary for decay are reduced. Skin tightens, tissues shrink, and the body stabilizes in a form that can endure for long periods. This process depends on a narrow balance of factors. Too much moisture and decay proceeds normally. Too much heat combined with humidity, and the body decomposes quickly. But in a dry, cold to moderate climate with limited biological activity, preservation becomes possible without human intervention. The surrounding landscape reinforces this process. The basin is enclosed by mountain ranges that shape wind patterns and limit the flow of moist air into the region. Rainfall is minimal, and the soil often lacks the organic richness that supports large populations of decomposers. In this sense, the environment acts not as a passive background, but as an active filter that determines what survives from the past. It allows certain materials, such as wool, leather, and plant fibers, to persist alongside the bodies, creating a fuller record of daily life than is usually available. This is why these discoveries feel different from typical archaeological findings. The presence of preserved clothing, for example, does not just add visual detail. It provides information about the materials people used, the the techniques they developed, and the conditions they lived under. Thick woven fabrics suggest the need for insulation. The choice of fibers reflects what was locally available or traded. Even the way garments are constructed can hint at repeated practices shaped by environment and necessity. Yet, it is important to remain careful. Preservation can create the impression that we are seeing a complete picture, when in reality, we are only seeing what the environment allowed to remain. Certain materials survive, while others are lost. Certain details appear clear, while others are missing entirely. The desert does not preserve everything equally. It selects. It favors dryness, stability, and resistance to biological decay. This selective preservation means that interpretation must always consider what is absent as well as what is present. In this way, the environment becomes part of the question, not just the answer. The reason we can see these bodies so clearly is tied directly to the same conditions that may have shaped how these people lived. Limited water, wide temperature ranges, and geographic isolation would have influenced movement, diet, and settlement patterns. These factors do not explain who these people were in a genetic sense, but they do explain how a population could exist in this space over time. They also remind us that human history is not only written in migration routes or genetic markers, it is written in the interaction between bodies and the environments they inhabit. The preserved mummies, then, are not simply unusual because of how they look. They are unusual because the environment has allowed them to remain visible at all, and this visibility is what makes the next question possible. Without this level of preservation, there would be far less to examine, and the larger uncertainty about their place in human history might never have emerged in such a clear form. The dry ground of the basin did more than preserve the bodies themselves. It also preserved the small surroundings that make a human life easier to understand. In many archaeological places, the body is separated from the soft world it once touched. Cloth disappears, wood rots, leather collapses, plant fibers return to soil. What remains is often durable material: stone, bone, pottery, metal, or the shape of a grave cut into the earth. But in this desert environment, the boundary between the body and its world did not vanish so completely. The garments stayed close to the skin. Hair remained visible. Wooden objects could survive. Woven materials retained their structure. Even fragile traces, which normally would have been lost, sometimes remained long enough to be studied. This matters because the question of the mummies is not only a question of DNA, it begins with the material world around them, and that world was preserved in unusual detail. When researchers look at clothing, they are not simply looking at decoration, they are looking at choices made under environmental pressure. A cold night, a dry wind, a long distance between sources of water, and the difficulty of moving across open land all shape what people wear and carry. Thick fabrics suggest protection against cold and exposure. Footwear, when preserved, can speak quietly about ground conditions and movement. Wood, used in burial structures, may point toward local resources or the movement of materials through exchange. None of these details gives a full identity by itself, but together they create a practical portrait of people living within a demanding landscape. The desert, therefore, does not only keep the dead visible, it keeps traces of adaptation visible. This is important because appearance can mislead us if we look too quickly. A preserved body may seem to offer direct access to the past, but the body alone cannot tell us how a population formed, how long it remained in a region, or how it related to neighboring groups. The surrounding materials help slow down that judgment. They remind us that people are not defined only by ancestry. They are also shaped by climate, available resources, routes of movement, and inherited habits. In a place like the Tarim Basin, where deserts and mountains create natural limits, daily life would have depended on finding stable ways to survive in difficult conditions. That kind of life can leave marks in objects before it leaves answers in history. The landscape also helps explain why the record feels both rich and incomplete. Because the environment preserves so much, it gives the impression of closeness. We can imagine the texture of clothing, the shape of a burial, the position of a body, and the surrounding objects. But even with this closeness, the most important questions remain distant. We do not hear their language. We do not know the names they used for themselves. We cannot assume what they believed, how they understood death, or how they described their own origins. The preserved materials can show repeated behavior, but they cannot provide inner life. This is where a calm and honest interpretation becomes necessary. The survival of soft tissue and organic objects is remarkable, yet it does not remove the limits of evidence. It only changes the kind of evidence available. Instead of guessing from a few bones, researchers can compare textiles, burial arrangements, body positions, and environmental patterns. But each comparison must remain tied to what can actually be seen, measured, and tested. The deeper importance of this preservation is that it allows the central mystery to emerge more clearly. If only bones had remained, the people of these burials might have seemed like one more ancient population among many. Because the bodies and objects survived together, they became harder to flatten into a simple category. Their world appears close enough to examine, but not close enough to fully name. The desert gives us a preserved surface of the past, while still keeping the deeper connections hidden. That is why these mummies continue to matter. They stand at the meeting point between visibility and uncertainty, where the human form remains clear, but the full route that brought these people into history is still not easy to follow. The preservation of the mummies can make the past feel unusually close, but closeness is not the same as certainty. This is one of the most important points in understanding why these bodies in Western China became so difficult to place within a simple historical explanation. The desert kept faces, hair, skin, clothing, and wooden burial elements from disappearing completely, and because of that, the people seem almost present. Yet the more visible they are, the more carefully we must separate what can be observed from what can only be guessed. A face can remain, but it cannot speak a language. A garment can survive, but it cannot prove an ancestry. A burial can show intention, but it cannot fully explain belief. The environment gives us a rare window, but the window does not open onto every room of the past. In a humid landscape, many of these questions might never have appeared in the same way, because the bodies and soft materials would likely have decayed long before they could be studied. In the dry basin, however, preservation created a larger archive of human traces. That archive is powerful because it includes the body and the world immediately around the body, but it is also uneven. Some materials survive better than others. Wool, leather, hair, wood, and plant fibers may remain, while softer foods, spoken traditions, gestures, relationships, and everyday routines disappear completely. What remains is not the whole life of a population. It is a filtered survival shaped by climate, burial conditions, soil chemistry, and chance. This matters because the title question depends on a careful distinction. The mummies did not become important simply because they looked different, or because their preservation seemed strange. They became important because the physical evidence was clear enough to invite deeper testing, while still leaving their broader human connections unresolved. The preserved bodies encouraged researchers to ask where these people came from, how long their communities remained in the region, and how they related to other groups moving across Inner Asia. But the preserved surface could not answer those questions alone. The desert had saved the outside of the story, not the full chain of descent behind it. This is why the movement from archaeology to ancient DNA became so important later. Before genetic evidence enters the discussion, the environmental evidence has already prepared the ground. It tells us that these were real communities living in a demanding place, not a myth, not a legend, and not a sudden isolated curiosity. Their lives were shaped by a region where water, distance, and terrain mattered deeply. The same dry air that preserved them may also reflect the conditions that shaped their daily choices. If movement across the region was difficult, if oases mattered, if mountains and deserts narrowed the paths between communities, then isolation and contact could both exist at the same time. A group might remain locally stable while still receiving objects, techniques, or ideas from elsewhere. This combination is one reason the evidence must be read slowly. A piece of clothing may resemble something from one direction, while a burial form may suggest another influence, and a genetic signal may later complicate both. Human history often works this way. It rarely moves in neat lines that follow modern maps. People can share tools without sharing much ancestry. They can borrow techniques without becoming the same population. They can live near routes of exchange while remaining biologically distinct in ways that only become visible much later. The environment of the Tarim Basin, then, does not solve the mystery, but it explains why the mystery survived. Without the dryness, the salts, the limited moisture, and the protective burial settings, the question might have faded with the bodies themselves. Instead, the land kept enough evidence intact for future generations to notice that something did not fit easily. The preserved mummies stand as a reminder that the past is not always hidden because it is gone. Sometimes it is hidden because the remaining evidence is too partial to speak in a single voice. The desert allowed these ancient people to remain visible, but it did not make them easy to define. It left behind a human presence that is clear in form, rich in material detail, and still uncertain in origin. That is the quiet power of these discoveries. They show us that preservation can bring the past closer, while also making its unanswered questions harder to ignore. When these preserved bodies are examined more closely, attention begins to move away from the surrounding landscape and toward the details carried on the bodies themselves. Clothing, hair, and visible physical features become part of the record, and because these elements have survived in an unusually complete state, they create a sense that the past is closer than it normally is in archaeology. Instead of working only with bones and fragments, researchers are faced with something that still holds shape, texture, and form. This closeness can feel almost direct, but it requires careful restraint, because what appears visible is not always fully understood. The garments found on these bodies are often one of the first elements to draw attention. They are not random coverings, but structured pieces made from woven materials that show repeated skill and familiarity with available resources. The thickness of the fabric, the layering of clothing, and the way it fits around the body all suggest practical decisions shaped by the environment. In a region where the air can be dry and temperatures can shift between day and night, clothing becomes a necessary form of protection rather than decoration. Wool, leather, and plant-based fibers, when preserved, indicate a reliance on materials that can provide insulation and durability. These choices reflect a long-term adaptation to a landscape where survival depends on maintaining body stability under changing conditions. At the same time, some of these textile features may appear familiar when compared to findings from other parts of Eurasia. Similar weaving patterns, stitching methods, or material combinations can be seen across distant regions. This similarity can create the impression of a direct connection, but such an interpretation must be approached slowly. Techniques can move between groups through contact, exchange, or imitation without requiring large-scale population movement. A method of weaving can spread across wide areas while the people themselves remain relatively stable in their original location. Because of this, visual similarity in clothing cannot be used as a definitive marker of origin. It suggests possibility, not certainty. Hair, when preserved, adds another layer of visible information, but it also introduces another level of uncertainty. In dry conditions, hair can survive in a form that still shows color and texture, giving the impression that personal identity is still present. However, environmental exposure after burial can alter these characteristics. Color may change over time, and texture may shift due to long-term desiccation. What appears to be a clear visual signal may not fully represent how the person looked during life. This means that even when preservation seems strong, interpretation must remain cautious. The same applies to facial structure. A preserved face can feel unusually immediate, creating a sense of recognition that is rare in archaeological contexts. But human facial variation is wide, and many features overlap across different populations. Without broader context, visual impressions can reflect modern expectations rather than historical reality. What seems unfamiliar in one region today may not have been unusual in the past, especially in areas shaped by movement and contact over long periods. The objects placed with the bodies follow a similar pattern of partial clarity. Wooden elements, woven mats, and personal items can survive in this environment, offering insight into repeated practices within a community. These objects suggest patterns of burial and daily life, but they do not form a complete cultural identity on their own. Items can be traded, copied, or adapted, and their presence does not always indicate origin. A tool or garment may reflect influence from one direction while the population itself developed along a different path. When all of these elements are considered together, clothing, hair, facial form, and burial objects, they create an image that is both detailed and unresolved. The people appear clearly enough to study, yet not clearly enough to define. This is where the central question begins to take shape more fully. The evidence provides texture and form, but it does not yet provide a clear position within the broader map of human populations. The bodies are visible, the details are preserved, and the patterns are present, but the deeper connections that link these individuals to known groups remain uncertain. This is not a failure of evidence, but a reflection of its limits. Each detail adds weight to the observation, yet none of them alone can answer the larger question. The result is a quiet tension between what can be seen and what cannot yet be explained, where the past appears close enough to examine, but still distant enough to remain open. As the examination continues, the focus begins to shift from what is immediately visible on the surface to how these visible details are arranged across different burial sites. A single preserved body can attract attention, but it is only when multiple burials are compared that patterns begin to emerge. These patterns are not always clear or uniform, but they provide a way to move beyond individual impressions and toward a broader understanding of how a population may have lived and organized itself. The placement of bodies, the orientation within graves, and the materials used in burial structures all become part of this larger view. In the dry regions of the Tarim Basin, some burials show repeated features that suggest shared practices, even if those practices do not form a single, easily defined cultural system. Bodies are often laid in consistent positions, and the use of wooden elements or markers appears across multiple sites. This repetition suggests that burial was not random, but guided by habits that carried meaning within the community. However, these habits do not fully match the well-documented burial traditions of surrounding regions, which introduces a quiet complication. The practices feel structured, but not easily classified. The objects placed with the bodies add another layer to this pattern. In some cases, items appear to be chosen with care, perhaps reflecting daily life or practical needs. In others, the selection seems minimal, suggesting a different emphasis in burial customs. This variation can occur even within the same general area, which makes it difficult to assign a single explanation. Instead of pointing to a fixed identity, the evidence suggests flexibility, where different groups or generations may have followed slightly different practices while still sharing a broader environment. This kind of variation is not unusual in human history, but it becomes more noticeable when preservation allows small details to remain visible. Clothing, too, contributes to this sense of pattern and variation. While certain textile techniques repeat, the exact form of garments can differ from one burial to another. Some clothing appears more layered or complex, while others are simpler in construction. These differences may reflect changes over time, differences in social roles, or simply the availability of materials. Without written records, it is not possible to assign a single reason, but the variation itself is meaningful. It suggests that the population was not static, and that life within this environment involved ongoing adaptation rather than strict uniformity. The same careful approach applies to physical features. While preserved faces and body forms may seem to invite comparison, patterns across individuals are not always consistent. Some features may appear similar, while others differ in ways that resist simple grouping. This reinforces the idea that visual observation alone cannot define a population. Human variation exists within groups as well as between them, and without additional context, differences can be misread as boundaries that may not have existed in the same way in the past. When these elements are brought together, burial structure, object placement, clothing variation, and physical features, they form a layered pattern that is both informative and incomplete. The evidence shows that people lived in this region over time, developed shared practices, and adapted to a challenging environment. At the same time, the lack of a clear, consistent framework connecting these practices to a known population keeps the question open. The patterns are real, but they do not resolve into a single identity. This is where the process of interpretation must remain steady and restrained. It is possible to describe what repeats, what changes, and what remains unclear, but it is not yet possible to draw a firm conclusion about origin or connection. The archaeological record provides structure, but not final answers. The more closely the details are examined, the more they show a population that was present, active, and shaped by its surroundings, yet not easily placed within the categories we use to describe human history today. This growing tension between visible pattern and uncertain identity prepares the ground for a different kind of evidence, one that does not rely on surface features alone, but looks deeper into the biological history carried within the body itself. The more these physical details are considered together, the more they reveal a careful boundary between what archaeology can show and what it cannot safely conclude. Clothing, burial forms, wooden structures, hair, and preserved faces all create a strong impression of closeness. They make the people of the Tarim Basin feel less distant than most ancient populations. Yet this closeness can be misleading if it is treated as certainty. A body may appear almost complete, but a complete-looking body is not the same as a complete historical record. The surface has survived, while many of the deeper connections remain hidden. This is why the study of these mummies must move slowly, especially when the question is not only how they looked, but how they belonged within the wider story of human populations. In the absence of written records, every object carries more pressure than it should. A piece of clothing may be asked to explain migration. A burial style may be asked to define a people. A face may be asked to reveal ancestry. But none of these things can carry that burden alone. Material culture is flexible. It can move through trade, imitation, marriage, seasonal contact, or simple practical need. A community living in a cold and dry region may develop clothing that resembles clothing from elsewhere because the same environmental problem produces similar solutions. A woven technique may spread across distance without proving that a whole population moved. A burial object may reflect exchange rather than origin. This means that similarity is useful, but it is not final. Difference is also useful, but it is not final either. The danger comes from turning either one into a fixed conclusion too early. The preserved bodies also remind us that ancient human groups did not organize themselves according to modern categories. Today, we often think in terms of nations, ethnic labels, borders, and named populations. But these categories are recent tools, shaped by modern history. They do not always fit deep human time. In the ancient world, especially in regions shaped by deserts, mountains, and oasis routes, communities could be connected in uneven ways. They might share some techniques with distant groups, remain locally rooted for generations, and still carry biological histories that do not match the visible objects around them. Culture and ancestry can move together, but they can also move separately. This distinction is central to understanding why the mummies are important. Their clothing and burial materials may suggest contact with wider Eurasian patterns, while their full origin cannot be decided by those details alone. The archaeological record, then, does not give a simple identity. It gives a set of conditions. It shows that these people lived in a demanding environment, used durable materials, followed repeated burial practices, and left behind enough preserved evidence to invite comparison. But it does not prove exactly where they came from, what language they spoke, or how they understood themselves. It does not allow us to say that they were this group or that group with complete confidence. A calm interpretation must accept that the evidence is both rich and limited. This does not weaken the story. It makes it more honest. The mystery is not created by exaggeration. It comes from the real gap between visible detail and historical certainty. By the end of this stage, the mummies have become more than preserved bodies. They have become a test of how carefully we read the past. If we rely only on appearance, we risk seeing what we expect to see. If we rely only on objects, we may confuse cultural contact with biological origin. If we force them into a known category too soon, we lose the most valuable part of the question. The real importance of these remains is that they stand at the edge of several kinds of evidence. Their bodies are visible, their material world is unusually well preserved, and their setting is clear enough to study. Yet their deeper place in human history still remains unresolved. This prepares the path for the next layer of inquiry, where researchers begin to look not only at what surrounded the body, but at the biological information still carried within it. Only then does the question move from appearance and artifacts toward the quieter, more complex evidence of ancient DNA. To understand these mummies more carefully, we have to step back from the preserved body and look at the setting around it. Archaeology does not read an ancient person as a single object. It reads the body together with the grave, the soil, the surrounding materials, the nearby burials, and the wider landscape. This matters because a preserved face can feel very direct, almost as if it is offering an answer by itself. But appearance alone cannot tell us where a population came from, how long it stayed in one place, or how it was connected to other groups. The first task is slower and more grounded, to ask where the body was found, how it was placed, what objects were nearby, and whether the same patterns appear again in other graves. In the Tarim Basin, this method is especially important because preservation is unusually strong. The desert allows skin, hair, clothing, wood, and woven material to remain visible, but visibility can create a false sense of certainty. A grave may look complete, yet still leave the central questions unanswered. Archaeologists therefore study the whole context, not just the most striking details. The position of a body, the use of wooden structures, the kind of textile placed with it, and the relationship between one burial and another all become small pieces of a larger pattern. These pieces do not speak loudly. They have to be compared, dated, and interpreted with restraint. Dating is one of the most important steps. If several burials are found in the same region, they may look related at first, but they may not belong to the same moment in time. A landscape can hold many layers of human life. People may use a similar area across different generations, or even across long periods, without being one single unchanged community. By placing remains and materials into a rough timeline, researchers can avoid turning separate moments into one simple story. This is essential for a place like Western China, where routes, oases, deserts, and mountains could shape movement in different ways over time. Material objects are read with the same caution. Clothing, wooden markers, tools, and burial goods can show habits, skills, and repeated customs. They may suggest that a community had shared ways of treating the dead or dealing with the environment, but they cannot prove ancestry by themselves. Objects can move through exchange. Techniques can be copied. A useful style of clothing can spread because it solves a practical problem, not because a whole population migrated. This is why archaeology must separate cultural evidence from biological origin. The two can overlap, but they are not always the same. A group may adopt ideas from far away while remaining locally rooted, or it may carry ancestry from elsewhere while using materials shaped by the place where it now lives. What archaeology can honestly show is a pattern of life and burial. It can show that these people occupied a real environment, used certain materials, and followed practices that were meaningful enough to repeat. It can show contact, adaptation, and change, but it cannot safely tell us their language, their self-name, or the full story of their origin. Those things are mostly beyond the reach of graves and objects alone. This is why the mummies remain so important to the central question. Before DNA is considered, the archaeology already shows a population that is visible, organized, and deeply connected to its landscape. Yet it also shows that visible evidence is not enough to place them neatly within the larger map of human history. The grave can tell us that they were here. The objects can show how they lived with the desert. The patterns can suggest continuity across time. But the deeper question of how they were biologically connected to other populations remains unresolved beneath the surface. As archaeological work continues, one of the most important steps is to move from isolated observations toward a structured reading of population patterns across time. This does not happen through a single discovery, but through comparison. Each burial, each object, and each preserved body becomes part of a larger dataset that must be arranged carefully. The question is no longer only what one individual looked like, or how one grave was constructed, but how these details repeat, change, or disappear when viewed across multiple sites. In a region like the Tarim Basin, where preservation allows unusual clarity, this comparison becomes both more powerful and more demanding. The evidence is rich, but it must be handled with restraint. One of the first patterns researchers look for is continuity. If similar burial structures, materials, and body positions appear across different locations and time layers, this may suggest that a population maintained certain practices over generations. Continuity does not prove that the same people remained unchanged, but it does indicate stability in behavior. It shows that knowledge was passed on, that certain ways of treating the dead were considered meaningful enough to repeat. In the desert environment, where resources are limited and movement is shaped by terrain, such stability can reflect long-term adaptation to local conditions. However, continuity is rarely perfect. Even within what appears to be a consistent pattern, small differences begin to emerge. Some burials include more objects, others fewer. Some garments are more complex, others more minimal. The materials used may shift slightly, suggesting either changes in available resources or changes in preference. These differences matter because they prevent the pattern from becoming too simple. They suggest that the population was not static, but experienced variation over time, possibly influenced by contact with other groups, environmental shifts, or internal changes within the community. Archaeology must hold both continuity and variation at the same time. If it focuses only on repetition, it risks ignoring change. If it focuses only on difference, it risks losing the larger structure. Another important aspect is spatial distribution. Burials are not scattered randomly. They often cluster in areas that may have been chosen for specific reasons, such as proximity to water sources, stable ground, or routes of movement. By mapping where these sites are located, researchers can begin to see how a population occupied the landscape. In the Tarim Basin, this often relates to the presence of oases and the narrow corridors between desert and mountain. These locations would have shaped where people could live, travel, and bury their dead. Over time, such patterns can suggest how communities were organized across space, even without written records. Yet even with this level of structure, a central limitation remains. Archaeology can describe how people lived and how they treated the dead, but it cannot fully define who they were in a biological sense. The patterns of burial and material culture show connection, but they do not show genetic lineage directly. A population can share practices with another group without sharing a close biological origin. Cultural behavior can move faster and more freely than genes. This is why the evidence must not be forced into a single narrative too early. It is possible to say that these people formed a structured presence in the region, that they adapted to a difficult environment, and that they maintained certain practices across time. But it is not yet possible to say exactly how they fit into the larger map of human populations. This gap between visible structure and biological identity is where the question becomes more precise. Archaeology has done its work by defining the context. It has shown that these mummies are part of a real, repeated pattern of human life in this landscape. It has shown that their presence is not accidental, and that their practices are not random. But it has also shown that surface evidence reaches a limit. Beyond that limit, another form of evidence is needed, one that does not depend on objects or appearance alone. This is where the study of ancient DNA begins to enter the story, not as a replacement for archaeology, but as a deeper layer that may help explain connections that the material record cannot fully reveal. As this careful reading of patterns reaches its limit, a quieter realization begins to form. Archaeology can describe a population in terms of place, habit, and material life, but it cannot fully answer the question of biological connection. It can show that people lived in a certain way, that they buried their dead with repeated forms, and that they adapted to the environment over time. It can even suggest contact with other regions through shared techniques or objects. But it cannot, on its own, trace the deeper lines of descent that link one population to another across long stretches of time. This is not a weakness of archaeology. It is simply the boundary of what material evidence can provide. In the case of the mummies found in Western China, that boundary becomes especially clear. The preserved bodies offer detail, the burial sites offer structure, the surrounding objects offer context. Together they form a picture that is more complete than most ancient records. Yet even with this level of preservation, the central question remains open. The people are visible, but their exact place within the wider human story is still uncertain. This is where the need for if objects and burial patterns can show how people lived, then something else is needed to show how they were connected at a deeper level. That something else is not visible on the surface. It does not depend on appearance, clothing, or burial form. It is carried within the body itself, in a form that survives even when most other signals are lost. The idea of using biological material to understand the past is not new, but it requires specific conditions to be effective. In many regions, the same processes that break down soft tissue also damage genetic material. Heat, moisture, and time can fragment DNA to the point where it becomes difficult to study. This is why the environment of the Tarim Basin becomes important again, but in a different way. The same dryness that preserved skin and clothing also increases the chances that fragments of DNA remain intact enough to be analysed. Without this preservation, the deeper question of ancestry might never have been approached with the same level of detail. When researchers begin to consider ancient DNA, the approach remains cautious. Extracting genetic material from ancient remains is a complex process, and the results must be interpreted carefully. Contamination from modern sources must be controlled. Fragmented sequences must be reconstructed. Patterns must be compared across known populations. This is not a quick answer, but a gradual method, much like archaeology itself. The difference is that DNA offers a different type of signal. It does not describe clothing, burial practice, or material culture. It describes inherited biological relationships, patterns of ancestry that extend beyond what can be seen directly. This is where the earlier archaeological work becomes essential. Without the context provided by graves, objects, and spatial patterns, genetic data would be difficult to interpret meaningfully. DNA alone can show connection, but it cannot explain how people lived. Archaeology alone can show life, but cannot fully trace connection. Together, they begin to approach a more complete understanding, even if that understanding remains partial. The transition from surface evidence to genetic evidence does not remove uncertainty. In many ways, it deepens it. Instead of asking only how these people lived, the question expands to include how they are related to other populations, whether nearby or distant, and whether those relationships follow expected patterns or not. It is at this point that the central tension of the story becomes sharper. The archaeological record suggests a population shaped by its environment, with practices that show both stability and variation. The preserved bodies suggest a human presence that is clear but not easily classified. Now, with the possibility of genetic analysis, a new layer is added, one that has the potential to confirm, complicate, or even challenge the patterns already observed. This is the moment where the question shifts. It is no longer only about what can be seen in the desert, but about what is carried within the remains themselves. The bodies are no longer just visible traces of the past. They become sources of biological information that can connect or separate them from the wider human story in ways that are not immediately predictable. And it is precisely at this point, when the evidence moves beneath the surface, that the most unexpected part of the story begins to take shape, not as a sudden answer, but as a deeper and more complex question than the one we started with. Ancient DNA changes the question because it does not begin with what the eye can see. It begins with what remains inside the body after death, broken into small fragments, altered by time, and mixed with the conditions of the place where the body was buried. In a living person, DNA is a long record of biological inheritance, passed from parents to children across generations. In ancient remains, that record is damaged, incomplete, and often difficult to separate from later contamination. This is why the study of ancient DNA must move more slowly than the mystery itself seems to demand. It does not offer an instant answer. It offers a method for testing whether the visible signs of a population match the deeper patterns carried in its biological history. For the mummies found in Western China, this matters because the earlier evidence had already reached a limit. Clothing, burial structures, and preserved faces could show presence, adaptation, and material life, but they could not clearly show ancestry. DNA offers a different kind of trace. It can reveal patterns of relatedness, not by naming a people in the modern sense, but by comparing inherited markers with those found in other ancient and present-day populations. The process begins with careful sampling. Researchers must choose parts of the body where genetic material is more likely to survive, often dense bone or teeth, because these can protect DNA better than exposed soft tissue. Even in a dry environment, the DNA is not whole. It is fragmented into short pieces, and many of those pieces may be damaged at the edges. The challenge is not simply to find DNA, but to identify which fragments truly belong to the ancient individual and which may come from soil, handling, or modern human contact. This is why contamination control is central to ancient DNA research. Samples are handled in specialized conditions, and the results are checked for patterns of damage that are typical of old genetic material. Without these safeguards, the data could become misleading. Once enough authentic fragments are recovered, they are compared with reference datasets. These datasets include genetic information from many populations, both ancient and modern, but they are never complete. This point is important. When scientists say a group does not clearly match known populations, it does not mean the people were outside humanity or unrelated to everyone else. It means that, within the available comparisons, their ancestry does not fit neatly into a familiar category. The phrase can sound dramatic, but scientifically it is more cautious. It points to a gap in our map, not to a separate kind of human. Ancient populations have often moved, mixed, disappeared, or survived only through faint traces. Some groups may not have direct modern descendants that are easy to identify. Others may be related to known populations in ways that are too old or too complex to appear as a simple match. This is why ancient DNA must be interpreted alongside archaeology, not above it. The genetic data may reveal a pattern that objects alone could not show, but it does not explain clothing, burial customs, language, or belief. It can suggest biological connections, but it cannot replace the physical context of the grave or the landscape. In the case of the Tarim mummies, DNA becomes valuable because it tests a deeper question beneath the visible evidence. Were these people closely tied to nearby populations? Were they connected to distant movements across Eurasia? Or did they preserve ancestry from an older population structure that is not well represented in later groups? These questions must remain careful because the evidence is still shaped by what has survived and what has been sampled. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it is not a perfect window. It is more like a faint signal travelling through time, strong enough to disturb simple explanations, but not always strong enough to create a final one. That is why this stage of the story feels important. The mummies are no longer only preserved bodies in a desert. They become carriers of a biological record that may show how incomplete our map of ancient humanity still is. The question deepens, not because the past becomes stranger, but because the tools for reading it become more precise, and precision often reveals how much remains unknown. The value of ancient DNA does not come from its ability to give a simple name to the dead. Its value comes from the way it can test relationships that the eye cannot see. When researchers study preserved remains, they are not searching for a label in the modern sense. They are looking for patterns of inheritance, small similarities and differences in genetic material that can show how one group may be connected, separated, or only distantly related to another. This is especially important for the mummies from Western China, because their visible world already contains mixed signals. Their clothing, burial settings, and physical preservation suggest a real population rooted in a demanding landscape. But these outward details cannot explain whether their ancestry came from nearby communities, distant movements, or an older line of population history that is no longer clearly represented today. Ancient DNA begins with fragments. After death, DNA breaks apart over time. It does not remain as a clean, complete record waiting to be read. Heat, moisture, soil chemistry, microbes, and handling can all damage it. Even when the environment is dry and favourable, the genetic material is still incomplete. Scientists therefore work with small pieces and compare them carefully, looking for patterns that are unlikely to be random. These patterns can then be placed beside genetic data from other ancient remains and from living populations. But the comparison is only as strong as the available samples. Many ancient groups have never been sampled. Many regions are unevenly represented. Some populations disappeared, merged with others, or left only faint traces in later people. Because of this, a genetic result that does not clearly match known populations should not be treated as a shocking claim that they came from nowhere. It means that the available genetic map is incomplete, and that these people may preserve a relationship to a population structure that is not easy to see in modern groups. This distinction is important for keeping the story honest. The phrase "no known population" can sound absolute, but in careful scientific language it is more limited. It refers to what can be compared, measured, and supported by current evidence. It does not mean the people were outside normal human history. It means their ancestry does not fall neatly into the categories researchers expected when using existing reference groups. In some cases, ancient DNA reveals that a population was more locally rooted than the objects around it might suggest. In other cases, it shows ancestry from movements that archaeology alone could not identify clearly. Sometimes it shows both continuity and contact, with one layer of ancestry remaining stable while cultural materials move across distance. This is why DNA must be placed beside the grave, the landscape, and the objects, not above them. A genetic pattern can show biological connection, but it cannot tell us what language people spoke, how they described themselves, or what meanings they attached to their dead. It can reveal descent, but not identity in the full human sense. For the Tarim Basin mummies, this makes the question more precise and more careful. The issue is not whether they were strange, separate, or impossible to explain. The issue is whether their preserved bodies carry traces of an ancient population history that does not match the simplest expectations formed from appearance or artifacts. Their DNA may point toward deep ancestry, local continuity, or a relationship with groups that are poorly represented in later records. Any of these possibilities would matter, because each would remind us that human history is not only made of the populations that survived clearly into the present, it is also made of groups whose traces became thin, whose descendants may have blended into others, or whose place in the genetic map remained hidden until ancient remains were studied directly. In this way, ancient DNA does not close the mystery too quickly. It gives the mystery firmer ground. It turns a visual puzzle into a biological question, and it shows that the preserved bodies in the desert are not only remarkable because they survived, but because they may still carry evidence of human connections that our present-day categories cannot fully contain. Ancient DNA is powerful because it can reach beneath appearance, but it is also fragile because it depends on survival, sampling, and comparison. This is the point where the story must stay especially careful. A genetic result is not a voice from the past speaking in a complete sentence. It is a pattern reconstructed from damaged fragments, and every pattern must be read against the limits of the evidence. For the mummies of Western China, this matters because the question has often been repeated in a way that sounds more absolute than science can safely support. To say that their DNA does not clearly match known populations is not to say that they had no relatives, no origin, or no place in humanity. It means that, when their genetic material is compared with available ancient and modern reference groups, the match is not simple, direct, or easily named. That difference may feel small, but it changes the whole tone of the story. It keeps the question honest. It prevents mystery from becoming exaggeration. DNA can show biological relationships, but it cannot turn those relationships into a full identity. It cannot tell us what these people called themselves. It cannot tell us what language they spoke, how they understood their dead, or how they saw the landscape around them. Those parts of life rarely survive in genetic material. They belong to culture, memory, speech, and daily practice. DNA can reveal inheritance, but human identity is never inheritance alone. This is why the biological evidence must remain tied to the archaeological evidence. The graves show place. The objects show material life. The environment shows why preservation happened. The DNA adds another layer, but it does not erase the others. In some ancient populations, genetic results confirm what archaeology already suggested. In others, they complicate it. A group may use objects that appear connected to distant regions while carrying ancestry that is more local. Another group may look locally adapted in its material culture while carrying biological signals from older movements across a wider landscape. These combinations are not unusual in human history. People have always exchanged tools, techniques, animals, plants, and ideas across boundaries that were not the same as genetic boundaries. Culture can travel through contact. Genes travel through reproduction. Sometimes they move together, sometimes they do not. The mummies become important because they sit precisely within this difficult space between visible culture and hidden ancestry. Their bodies are unusually well preserved, but that preservation does not make their origin simple. Their objects are meaningful, but they cannot be treated as proof of descent. Their DNA may carry signals that do not fit neatly into expected categories, but that does not make them separate from the broader human story. Instead, it shows that the broader story may be less complete than we once assumed. Many ancient populations are known only through fragments. Some left descendants who are difficult to trace. Some were absorbed into later groups. Some lived in regions where the modern genetic map no longer preserves their older structure clearly. When ancient DNA reveals an unexpected pattern, It may be showing us not an impossible people, but a missing piece of the map. This is the final lesson before the story moves into the actual meaning of the genetic results. Ancient DNA should not be used to create a dramatic conclusion too quickly. It should be used to ask better questions. How much of this ancestry was local? How much was connected to older populations across Eurasia? How much of what we see in clothing and burial reflects contact rather than descent? And how much of human history has disappeared from the categories we use today? The preserved mummies do not answer all of this at once. They simply make the question stronger. They show that the past can be visible in the face, practical in the clothing, structured in the grave, and still uncertain in the bloodline. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the most honest doorway into the next stage of the story, where DNA begins to reveal not a final identity, but a deeper and more careful problem of human connection. When the first genetic results began to emerge from the preserved remains in the Tarim Basin, they did not arrive as a clear statement. They appeared as patterns that required careful reading, and at first, those patterns did not settle easily into the frameworks researchers had already built from archaeology and known population histories. The expectation, based on earlier studies of human movement across Eurasia, was that any ancient group in this region would show a mixture of influences. The basin sits between larger zones of movement, where people, materials and ideas have crossed over long periods of time. Because of this, it would be reasonable to expect genetic signals that reflect that mixture. Instead, the early interpretations suggested something more complex. The DNA did not clearly align with nearby populations in a simple way, and it did not present a straightforward combination that could be easily explained by known migration routes. This did not mean the data was contradictory. It meant that the patterns were not as simple as expected. Some genetic markers appeared to reflect deep ancestry that was not strongly connected to later populations in the same region. Other expected signals were weaker than predicted, or absent in ways that required explanation. This created a quiet tension between what the archaeological setting suggested and what the genetic data began to indicate. The landscape and burial patterns showed a population that lived within a network of possible contact, but the genetic evidence hinted at a degree of separation in biological terms. This is the point where careful interpretation becomes essential. A result that does not match expectations can be read in two ways. It can be treated as a dramatic anomaly, or it can be understood as a sign that the existing model is incomplete. In scientific work, the second approach is more reliable. The Tarim mummies did not appear to represent a population outside human variation. Instead, they appeared to preserve a pattern of ancestry that did not fit neatly into the categories formed from later populations. This is not unusual in deep history. Many ancient groups are known only through limited remains, and their genetic structure may not be fully represented in modern populations. Over time, populations merge, split, move or disappear, leaving behind traces that are unevenly distributed. What we see today is not a complete record of what once existed. The genetic signals from these mummies may reflect such an older structure, one that has been partially lost or absorbed into later groups. Another possibility that researchers consider is long-term isolation. In a region shaped by deserts and mountains, a population could remain relatively stable over many generations, with limited external genetic input. Even if cultural contact occurred, biological exchange might have been more restricted. This would allow certain ancestral patterns to persist more clearly than in regions with constant mixing. However, this idea must also be treated carefully. Isolation is rarely absolute. Even in difficult environments, some level of movement and interaction usually exists. The question is not whether the population was isolated or connected, but how those two conditions balanced over time. The early genetic results do not provide a single answer to that question. Instead, they show that the balance may have been different from what researchers expected. The population may have lived in a space where cultural exchange and biological continuity did not move in the same direction. This would explain why material evidence can suggest wider connections, while genetic evidence suggests a more specific and stable ancestry. At this stage, the results do not close the question, they refine it. They show that the mummies are not easily explained by a simple model of migration and mixture, but they do not yet provide a complete alternative. The data invites further comparison, deeper sampling, and more careful integration with the archaeological record. It also reminds us that human history is not always organized in ways that match modern expectations. The patterns we see today are shaped by survival, loss, and change over long periods. The people of the Tarim Basin may represent one of those patterns that remained partially hidden until preserved bodies and recoverable DNA brought it back into view. The meaning of the genetic results becomes clearer when we avoid, treating ancestry as a set of clean labels. In modern language, we often speak as if populations are fixed groups with clear edges, but ancient human history rarely works that way. A population can carry ancestry from very old sources, remain in one region for a long time, and still borrow objects, practices, or technologies from neighboring groups. This is why the Tarim Basin mummies are difficult to explain through appearance or artifacts alone. Their material world can suggest contact with wider Eurasian traditions, while their genetic pattern may point toward deeper continuity that does not match the simplest expectation of migration. The important point is not that these people were disconnected from all others. They were human, part of the same larger history of movement, adaptation, and descent. The more careful question is whether they preserved a genetic profile that had become rare, hidden, or poorly represented in later populations. When scientists compare ancient DNA, they are not comparing one person to one modern group in a simple way. They are looking at shared ancestry across many markers. Some markers may be closer to one ancient source, others may show distance from groups that lived nearby at later times. A result can therefore feel surprising without being impossible. It may show that the population was not formed in the way researchers first expected. In the case of these mummies, one of the important interpretations is that they may reflect ancestry connected to very ancient northern Eurasian population layers, rather than a recent and simple arrival from a single neighbouring region. This must be said carefully, because ancient ancestry is not the same as modern identity. It does not mean they belong to a modern nation, ethnic group, or language family. It means their biological history may reach back into older population structures that were spread differently from the populations we see today. This helps explain why the phrase matches no known population can be both useful and dangerous. It is useful because it captures the feeling that the genetic pattern does not fall neatly into familiar categories. It is dangerous because it can make the results sound more absolute than it is. No ancient group comes from nowhere. Every group has ancestors, relatives, and connections, but those connections may not be visible in our current reference data. If the groups most closely related to them later disappeared, mixed with others, or were never sampled, then the genetic signal will appear unusual. The mismatch may reveal a limitation in our map rather than a complete break from human continuity. This is also where the landscape becomes relevant again. The Tarim Basin is not an empty stage. It is a place of deserts, oases, mountains, and corridors. Such a landscape can create a special balance between contact and separation. People might encounter goods, animals, techniques, and ideas that moved along wider routes, while their own community remained biologically more stable over generations. In other words, culture could enter more easily than ancestry. A woven style, a tool form, or a burial custom could spread across distance without requiring the replacement of one population by another. This distinction is essential for keeping the story truthful. The DNA does not erase the archaeological evidence. It complicates it. The objects show that these people were part of a world where contact was possible. The DNA suggests that contact did not necessarily reshape their ancestry in the way one might expect. That contrast is the center of the puzzle. It shows that the mummies are not important because they are strange in a dramatic sense, but because they reveal how incomplete our simple models of the past can be. Human history is not always a chain of clear replacements. Sometimes it is a quiet persistence of older ancestry inside a changing cultural landscape. Sometimes a group remains biologically distinct while living near routes of exchange. Sometimes what looks connected on the surface is more separate underneath. The genetic results, therefore, do not give a final identity. They give a more precise question. How did this population remain visible in the genetic record while not matching the expected surrounding patterns? How much of their ancestry belonged to older human layers that later became difficult to trace? And how many other ancient groups once existed in similar ways, leaving only faint signals that we are only beginning to recognize? This is why the mummies matter beyond the desert where they were found. They remind us that the past is not only made of the groups whose names survived, It is also made of populations whose biological traces remained buried, waiting for the moment when new tools could reveal that the human map was never as complete as it seemed. The most important thing about the genetic results is not that they make the mummies impossible to explain, it is that they make the older explanation less simple. Before ancient DNA, the preserved bodies could be interpreted mainly through what was visible: clothing, burial forms, the desert setting, and physical appearance. These clues suggested a population living in a region where different worlds could meet. But once genetic evidence entered the discussion, the question moved into a deeper layer. It was no longer enough to ask whether the objects looked familiar, or whether the burial practices resembled those of nearby or distant groups. The stronger question became whether the biological history of these people followed the same routes suggested by their material world. In many cases, culture and ancestry can move together, but the Tarim mummies remind us that they do not have to. A group may adopt tools, clothing styles, food practices, or burial habits from others without being replaced by those others. A community may live near corridors of exchange while still preserving an older genetic pattern across generations. This possibility helps explain why the results felt unusual. The DNA did not neatly support a simple story of one known population arriving, settling, and leaving behind these bodies. It also did not reduce the mummies to a clear mixture of surrounding groups. Instead, the evidence suggested that their ancestry may have belonged to a deeper and more complex population background, one not easily represented by later people in the same region. This does not mean they were separate from human history. It means the part of human history they represent may not have survived clearly in the modern genetic record. That is a very different idea. It is quieter, but more meaningful. Human populations are not permanent boxes. They are moving lines, sometimes strong, sometimes fading, sometimes merging into others until their older shape becomes difficult to see. Over thousands of years, a population can disappear as a separate group without vanishing completely. Its ancestry may become scattered, diluted, or hidden inside later communities. Another population may leave almost no visible descendants, yet still appear in ancient DNA when preserved remains are studied. The mummies matter because they may show one of these older layers, not fully lost, but not easily matched either. This is where the phrase, "no known population," must be handled with care. It should not be used to suggest that these people came from nowhere, or that they were outside ordinary human descent. Every human group comes from earlier humans. Every population is connected somewhere in the long structure of ancestry. The problem is that our evidence is incomplete. We do not possess DNA from every ancient community that once lived. We do not have equal samples from every region or time. We cannot compare these mummies with populations whose remains have never been found, never been tested, or no longer exist as distinct groups. So the mismatch is not a magical break in the human story. It is a gap in the part of the story we can currently measure. This makes the discovery more honest, not less interesting. It shows that the desert preserved enough biological material to challenge a simple map, but not enough to replace it with a final answer. The genetic evidence sharpens the mystery without turning it into fantasy. It suggests that Western China was not only a place where cultures met, but also a place where older population histories could persist in ways that later history made harder to recognize. The burials show presence. The clothing shows adaptation. The landscape shows difficulty and partial isolation. The DNA adds one more layer, a sign that the people preserved there may not fit neatly into the known genetic patterns around them. By the end of this stage, the question has become more precise. It is not simply who these mummies were by appearance, or what objects they carried into death. It is how a real human population could live in a connected world, preserve an ancestry that seems difficult to match, and leave behind a record clear enough to disturb the map, but not complete enough to close the question. Some ancient populations are difficult to understand because they did not remain visible in the way later history prefers. We often imagine the past as a chain of recognizable groups, each one leading clearly into another, until the present becomes the natural ending of the story. But human population history is not that neat. Many groups once lived, moved, mixed, separated, and faded without leaving a clear name or a direct modern identity. Some left tools, some left graves, some left traces in the bodies of later people. Others left only fragments that appear briefly when archaeology or ancient DNA brings them back into view. The mummies of Western China matter because they may belong to this wider problem. Not a people without origin, but a people whose origin is harder to see because the population world around them changed. When we say that a group may have disappeared, we do not mean that every person vanished suddenly. More often, disappearance is slow. A community can be absorbed into neighboring groups through marriage, migration, disease, climate pressure, or changes in settlement. Its language may be replaced. Its burial customs may end. Its material culture may be copied, altered, or abandoned. Over many generations, the group may no longer exist as a separate population, even though parts of its ancestry continue in scattered form. This is one reason ancient DNA can surprise us. It sometimes reveals older population layers that are no longer easy to identify in living people. The Tarim mummies should be understood within this calm and careful frame. Their genetic pattern may seem unusual because it does not match later or nearby populations in a simple way, but that does not make them outside the human story. It may mean that they preserve a signal from a population structure that was once more common, then became obscured by later movements and mixing. In deep history, this is not rare. The world before written records was full of small communities, regional groups, and long-term local populations whose names are lost to us. They did not know they were future mysteries. They were simply people living inside the limits and possibilities of their own landscape. The desert, the mountains, and the oases of the Tarim Basin may have allowed some ancestry to persist for a long time, even while objects, techniques, and ideas move through the region. This helps explain why the archaeological and genetic evidence can seem to pull in different directions. The material world may show contact. The DNA may show continuity. Both can be true. A population can be culturally connected and biologically more stable. It can borrow from outside while maintaining older ancestry within the community. It can live near movement without being completely reshaped by it. This kind of pattern becomes difficult for us because modern categories are often built from surviving groups, modern borders, and later historical names. Ancient people did not always fit into those categories, and many of their population lines did not survive as clear labels. This is why the idea of vanished populations is useful, as long as it is not made dramatic. It does not mean a lost race, a secret origin, or a separate branch of humanity. It means that the human map was once more crowded and more layered than the present can show. Some groups left strong descendants. Others became thin signals. Others are known only because a burial, a bone, or a preserved body survived long enough to be studied. The mummies in Western China remind us that the past can contain people who were fully real, locally adapted, and historically important, even if they cannot be matched neatly to a known modern population. Their value is not in being impossible. Their value is in showing that our present-day map is only the latest surface of a much older and more complex human landscape. Beneath that surface, older populations may still be waiting, not to overturn human history, but to make it deeper, slower, and more honest. If we stay with this idea of populations that slowly fade from clear view, the next step is to understand how that fading actually happens in human history. It rarely occurs as a sudden break. More often, it is a gradual process where boundaries become less visible over time. A community may begin as a relatively stable group in a defined landscape, shaped by shared practices, environment, and inherited ancestry. But as generations pass, pressures begin to shift. Climate can change the availability of water and land. Trade routes can bring new materials and new people. Neighboring groups can move closer, settle, or pass through. Each of these forces does not erase a population immediately. Instead, they begin to blur its edges. People marry across groups. Children carry mixed ancestry. Old customs continue for a time, then slowly change. Over many generations, what once was a distinct group becomes harder to separate from those around it. This kind of blending is not unusual. It is one of the most common patterns in human history. The Tarim Basin provides a setting where this process can be imagined carefully. It is not an open plain where movement is easy in every direction. It is a region structured by deserts, oases, and mountain boundaries. Movement is possible, but it is guided. People do not spread evenly. They follow water, roots, and seasons. This creates a special balance. Communities can remain locally stable for long periods, yet still encounter outsiders at certain points. A traveller may pass through. A small group may settle. Goods may arrive without large numbers of people moving. Over time, these small connections accumulate. The result is not a complete replacement of one population by another, but a gradual layering of influence. Some layers affect culture more strongly, others affect ancestry more slowly. This helps explain why the genetic pattern of the mummies may feel distinct, even when their material world suggests contact. Cultural exchange can happen with relatively few individuals. A weaving technique, a tool design, or a burial form can be observed and copied without requiring large-scale migration. In contrast, genetic change usually requires sustained interaction across generations. If a community remains relatively stable in size and structure, and if contact is limited or uneven, its ancestry can remain more continuous than its material culture. This difference in speed between cultural and biological change is often overlooked, but it is central to understanding ancient populations. Another part of this process is uneven survival. Not all populations leave the same kind of trace. Some become part of later, larger groups and are visible only as a small contribution to a broader genetic pattern. Others may leave almost no clear descendants that can be easily identified today. Their ancestry may be diluted, scattered, or hidden within populations that later changed in different ways. This does not mean they were unimportant. It means that the pathways of survival are uneven. What survives clearly in the present is only a portion of what once existed. Ancient DNA allows us to see some of these missing layers again, but only where preservation makes it possible. The mummies from Western China may represent one of these layers. Their genetic signal may reflect a population that once existed more clearly, then became less visible as surrounding regions changed. Their environment may have allowed that signal to persist longer than in other places, while their cultural world continued to interact with wider networks. This combination can feel unusual, but it is consistent with what we know about how human populations behave over long periods. It also explains why the results do not form a simple story. There is no single moment where one group arrives and replaces another in a clean line. Instead, there is a long process of presence, contact, and gradual transformation. The people represented by these mummies were part of that process, not outside it. Their ancestry may have been shaped by older population structures, while their daily life was shaped by a landscape that connected them, in limited ways, to others. By looking at fading populations in this way, the question becomes calmer and more grounded. We are not asking how something impossible appeared. We are asking how a real human group could remain visible in one form while becoming less visible in another. The answer lies not in a single event, but in the slow movement of people, ideas, and environments across time. By the time we reach this point, the idea of a missing or hard-to-place population no longer feels unusual. It begins to feel expected. Human history, when seen over long periods, is not a clean sequence of clearly named groups replacing one another. It is a shifting field of communities that form, adapt, connect, and gradually change shape. Some of these communities become visible in later history because they leave strong descendants, written records, or lasting cultural structures. Others become quieter. Their presence is real, but their continuity is harder to follow because their lines of descent do not remain sharply defined. The mummies from Western China can be understood within this quieter part of the human past. They do not need to represent something outside the known story. They may represent a part of the story that simply did not remain visible in the same way. This is where the earlier evidence begins to come together more clearly. The environment explains why their bodies survived. The burial patterns show that they belong to a structured community. The objects suggest adaptation and contact. The DNA suggests a pattern of ancestry that does not align easily with later populations. None of these elements contradict one another. Instead, they describe different layers of the same situation. A population living in a challenging environment, maintaining continuity over time, interacting with others at the level of culture, and preserving a biological signal that later history does not display in a simple form. This combination is not strange when placed within the broader context of human evolution and migration. It is only unexpected because we often imagine the past as simpler than it was. The idea of vanished or transformed populations also changes how we understand the phrase no known population. It no longer points to something dramatic or separate. It points to a limit in our current knowledge. A population can exist, live fully, and leave traces, yet still not fit into the categories we have built from surviving groups. Those categories are shaped by what lasted, not by everything that once existed. Ancient DNA sometimes reveals this gap by bringing back signals that do not match our simplified map. In doing so, it does not create a mystery out of nothing. It reveals that the mystery was always there, hidden beneath the surface of incomplete evidence. This leads to a more careful understanding of identity in the ancient world. Identity is not only biological, it is also shaped by language, belief, practice, and shared experience. A group may change its cultural expression while maintaining biological continuity. Another group may change biologically while keeping certain cultural forms. Over time, these layers shift independently. When we look back at ancient populations, we often see only fragments of each layer, and those fragments do not always align in a simple way. The Tarim mummies remind us of this separation. Their cultural signals can be compared, their biological signals can be measured, but neither alone can define who they were in a complete sense. This is why the question must remain open, not as a sign of uncertainty in a negative sense, but as a sign of accuracy. A closed answer, given too early, would reduce the evidence to a story that fits our expectations rather than the past itself. An open question allows the evidence to remain what it is, detailed, consistent, and still incomplete. It allows us to accept that some populations may not have a clear continuation into the present, and that their place in human history must be understood through careful reconstruction rather than simple naming. By the end of this stage, the mummies are no longer seen as an isolated puzzle. They become part of a broader pattern in which ancient populations can remain visible in one form while fading in another. Their bodies survive, their environment is known, their practices can be studied, their ancestry leaves a signal, but the full path that connects them to later human populations is still only partially visible. This does not weaken the story. It deepens it, showing that human history includes many lives and many groups that do not remain fully visible, yet still shape the larger structure of who we are today. To understand how these people might have reached the Tarim Basin in the first place, it is necessary to widen the view beyond a single region and consider the broader movement of human populations across Eurasia. Long before written history, humans were already spreading across large distances, adapting to different climates, and forming networks of contact that did not follow the borders we know today. These movements were not always fast or continuous. They often happened in stages, with groups settling for long periods, then moving again when conditions changed. Over time, this created a layered pattern of population history, where older and newer groups could overlap, merge, or remain partly separate. The Tarim Basin sits within this wider landscape, positioned between mountain ranges and open corridors that have, at different times, allowed movement from multiple directions. One of the important features of Eurasian prehistory is that it was not defined by a single migration route. Instead, there were many pathways, shaped by geography. In some areas, wide grasslands allowed relatively open movement. In others, deserts and mountains created narrow passages where travel was more controlled. The Tarim Basin belongs to this second type. It is not a place where large populations could easily spread in all directions. Movement tends to follow the edges, the oases, and the routes where water is available. This means that populations entering or living in the basin would likely have done so in a structured way, influenced by the constraints of the land. At the same time, this does not mean isolation in a complete sense. Even in difficult environments, people have always found ways to connect. Small groups can travel long distances over generations. Trade networks can form between distant regions, carrying materials, techniques, and ideas. These networks do not require constant large-scale migration. They can exist as a series of links, where each group interacts with its neighbors and influence travels step by step across the landscape. In this way, the Tarim Basin may have been connected to broader Eurasian systems, even if its internal population remained relatively stable in biological terms. This perspective helps explain why the mummies can appear both connected and distinct at the same time. Their material culture may reflect contact with wider regions, while their genetic pattern may preserve older or more localized ancestry. The two do not have to match perfectly because they follow different pathways. Cultural exchange can move quickly across networks. Biological ancestry usually changes more slowly, requiring sustained interaction across generations. When we look at ancient migration in this way, the question becomes less about a single origin point and more about how different layers of movement and stability combine over time. A population in the Tarim Basin may have been shaped by earlier migrations that brought people into the region, followed by long periods of relative stability. Later contacts may have added cultural elements without fully replacing the population. This creates a situation where the visible evidence reflects multiple time layers at once, some older, some more recent, and not always aligned in a simple way. It is also important to remember that our current understanding of ancient migration is incomplete. Archaeological sites are unevenly distributed. Some regions are well studied while others remain less explored. Ancient DNA samples are still limited, and many past populations have not yet been analysed. Because of this, the routes we draw on maps are not final. They are models based on available evidence, and they can change as new data appears. The Tarim mummies fit into this uncertainty by highlighting a part of the map that does not yet connect smoothly with the rest. They suggest that there were movements, settlements, and population structures that are not fully captured by the simplest models of Eurasian migration. This does not make them an exception to human history. It makes them a reminder that the history itself is still being reconstructed. Their presence encourages a broader view, where migration is not a single path, but a network of movements shaped by environment, time, and human adaptation. Within that network, it is entirely possible for a population to carry ancestry that does not align neatly with later groups, especially if it reflects an older layer of human movement that became less visible over time. The movement of ancient people across Eurasia was shaped less by straight lines than by passages of possibility. A group did not simply walk from one end of the continent to another as if the land were open and even. Mountains interrupted movement, deserts slowed it, rivers guided it. Grasslands allowed wider travel, while basins and oases pulled people into more specific routes. This is why the Tarim Basin is so important to the question of the mummies. It sits in a place where different landscapes meet, but not in a way that makes movement simple. To enter, cross, or remain in such a region, people had to follow the conditions of the land. Water mattered, shelter mattered, seasonal change mattered. The body could not ignore geography. Over long periods, these limits may have shaped how populations arrived, stayed, separated, and connected again. In many parts of ancient Eurasia, movement happened through open steppe environments where herding, travel, and contact could stretch across wide distances. But the Tarim Basin was different. It was surrounded and shaped by barriers. The desert made central movement difficult. The mountains created edges and corridors. Oases became points of life, where water and settlement could exist in an otherwise demanding landscape. This kind of geography can produce a special pattern in population history. People may be close enough to routes of contact to receive objects, ideas, or techniques, but separated enough to preserve older ancestry for long periods. This may help explain why the archaeological record and the genetic record do not always point in the same direction. A population living near a route of movement does not automatically become genetically mixed with every group that passes through. Contact can be brief, uneven, or limited to certain kinds of exchange. A tool can travel farther than a family. A textile technique can move faster than a population. A burial custom can be borrowed without changing the biological ancestry of the people who practice it. This is an important idea for understanding the mummies in a calm and truthful way. Their world may have been connected, but connection does not always mean replacement. The presence of wider cultural signals does not require a simple story of migration from one known place. It may reflect a long landscape of contact, where people at different points shared useful practices while remaining partly distinct in ancestry. The same region can hold both movement and continuity. It can be a corridor for some people and a home for others. It can allow exchange while still preserving local population structure. Over time, this creates layers that are difficult to separate. Some layers belong to older settlement, some belong to later contact. Some appear in objects, others appear in DNA. When these layers are read together, they do not always form a neat answer. Instead, they show how complex the human past can be when geography controls movement so strongly. The Tarim mummies seem important because they stand at this meeting point. Their preserved bodies show people who lived in a real landscape, not an abstract migration map. Their materials suggest practical adaptation and possible contact. Their DNA raises the possibility that some ancestry remain distinct from the populations we might expect nearby. This does not make them mysterious in a careless sense. It makes them useful. They help us see that ancient migration was not only about large groups moving across empty land, it was also about small communities staying, surviving, receiving influence, and carrying older biological histories through difficult environments. If we imagine Eurasia as a wide human web rather than a set of clean arrows, the mummies begin to fit more honestly. They may represent one point in that web where old ancestry, local survival, and outside contact overlapped without merging into a simple identity. The question, then, is not only where they came from, it is how a population could live inside a connected world while still preserving a genetic signal that later maps struggle to recognize. When these movements are considered together, the idea of a single root or a single origin becomes less useful. What begins to appear instead is a layered landscape of human presence, where different groups arrived at different times, stayed for different lengths, and left traces that do not always align. The Tarim Basin can be understood as one of these layered spaces. It is not simply a destination or a passage. It is a place where movement slows down, where some groups continue through, and where others remain long enough to form a stable presence. This creates a record that contains both motion and stillness at the same time. In such a landscape, the timing of arrival becomes important. A population that enters early, during a period when fewer groups are present, may establish itself in a relatively stable way. If later movements pass through the region without fully replacing that earlier group, then the older ancestry can remain, even as new cultural influences appear. Over time, this creates a situation where the visible material world reflects multiple layers of contact, while the biological ancestry reflects a deeper continuity. The mummies from Western China may represent this kind of early layer, preserved by the environment and made visible through both archaeology and DNA. This possibility does not require a dramatic event. It follows from patterns seen in other parts of human history, where early populations persist in certain regions while later movements shape the surrounding areas more strongly. Another factor is direction. Movement across Eurasia did not occur in only one way. People could enter regions from different directions at different times, and not all of those movements were equal in scale. Some may have involved small groups, gradual expansion, or seasonal movement rather than large waves of migration. These smaller movements can be difficult to trace, especially if they do not leave strong archaeological signals or if their genetic contribution becomes diluted over time. Yet, they can still matter. They can introduce new practices, create points of contact, or shift the balance of a population without fully replacing it. In a region like the Tarim Basin, where geography channels movement, these smaller and uneven processes may have played an important role. This helps explain why the mummies do not fit neatly into a single migration story. If we expect them to belong to one clear wave of movement, the evidence feels incomplete. But if we see them as part of a longer sequence of arrivals, stays, and interactions, their position becomes more understandable, even if it remains partially uncertain. They may reflect a population that formed during an earlier phase of human movement, then remained in place while later networks passed nearby. Their cultural world could have been influenced by these networks, while their ancestry retained older characteristics that are less visible in later populations. It is also important to remember that not all migration leaves the same kind of trace. Some movements result in large population changes that are easy to detect. Others leave lighter signals that are harder to follow, especially when later history reshapes the region. Climate shifts, changes in trade routes, and the rise of new societies can all alter how populations are distributed. Over time, earlier patterns can be covered by later ones, making the original structure difficult to recover. The Tarim mummies may preserve a moment before some of these later changes became dominant. This does not make them separate from the broader human story. It places them within an earlier part of it, one that is not fully visible in the present. By the end of this stage, the idea of migration has changed. It is no longer a simple path from one place to another. It is a network of movements that vary in speed, scale, and impact. Within that network, it is possible for a population to carry an ancestry that does not match later expectations, especially if it formed under different conditions and remained relatively stable over time. The mummies in the Tarim Basin do not need to be explained by a single route or a single origin. They can be understood as part of a complex system where human groups moved, settled, interacted, and sometimes remained, leaving behind traces that only now begin to connect into a more careful and complete picture. When we look again at the Tarim Basin, after understanding these wider movements, the role of isolation begins to feel more precise. Isolation does not mean complete separation from the world. It means a condition where contact exists, but is limited, uneven, and shaped by geography in ways that slow down change. In a landscape defined by desert, mountains, and scattered oases, the human body cannot move freely in all directions. Travel requires knowledge of routes, access to water, and the ability to endure long distances under difficult conditions. This creates natural boundaries that do not need walls or borders. They are built into the land itself. For a population living within such a space, this has long-term effects. People can remain in one region for many generations without being fully replaced by incoming groups, even if contact occurs from time to time. This is where the idea of genetic continuity becomes important. If a community remains relatively stable in size and structure, and if new individuals enter only occasionally, the overall genetic pattern may change slowly. Over many generations, small changes can accumulate, but the deeper structure can remain recognizable. This is different from regions where constant large-scale movement leads to rapid mixing and the blending of multiple populations into a new pattern. The Tarim Basin may have allowed this slower process to take place. The same environmental conditions that preserved the mummies may also have contributed to maintaining a more stable population structure over time. Water sources, for example, would have limited where people could live. Oases become points of settlement, and movement between them is not random. This creates a pattern where communities are connected, but not constantly merging. They may interact, trade, or share certain practices, but still remain distinct enough for older ancestry to persist. This helps explain why the genetic results can show a pattern that does not match surrounding populations in a simple way. It is not that the people were cut off completely, but that the balance between contact and continuity was different. Cultural exchange could happen without full biological integration. Tools, clothing styles, or burial customs could move through the region more easily than large numbers of people. Over time, this creates a situation where the visible world suggests connection, while the genetic record suggests stability. Another important factor is time itself. Isolation, even in a partial form, becomes more significant when it lasts for long periods. A population that remains in a region for centuries or longer, with only limited external input, can develop a genetic profile that reflects its earlier history more strongly than its later contacts. If surroundings change due to new migrations, environmental shifts, or social developments, the difference between the local population and its neighbors can become more noticeable. This difference is not created suddenly. It grows slowly as the world around the population changes in ways that do not fully reshape the population itself. The Tarim mummies may reflect such a situation. Their ancestry could represent a layer that remained relatively stable while other regions experienced more visible change. This does not mean that the population was static or unchanging. No human group is. It means that the rate and direction of change may have been different. Some aspects of life, especially those related to survival in a difficult environment, may have remained consistent. Other aspects, such as material culture, may have adapted through contact. The result is a population that appears connected on the surface, but retains a deeper continuity underneath. This kind of pattern becomes difficult to recognize if we expect all populations to follow the same path of mixing and replacement. Human history includes both movement and persistence. Some groups change rapidly, others change slowly. Some become part of larger populations. Others remain locally defined for long periods before eventually blending into wider patterns. The mummies in the Tarim Basin show how isolation, even when incomplete, can preserve a distinct layer of human ancestry. They remind us that the past includes not only the populations that expanded and reshaped large regions, but also those that remained in place, adapting quietly to their environment while carrying older histories forward in ways that only become visible when the right conditions allow them to be studied. Isolation, when viewed over long periods, does not act as a fixed barrier. It acts more like a filter. It allows some forms of contact to pass through while holding others back. In the Tarim Basin, this filtering effect may have shaped both daily life and long-term population structure in ways that are not immediately visible. People could meet, exchange goods, learn techniques, and even share certain customs without fully merging at the biological level. The environment made complete separation unlikely, but it also made constant large-scale mixing difficult. This middle condition is important because it creates a slower rhythm of change, where ancestry can remain more stable than the visible signs of culture. To understand this, it helps to imagine how interaction might have occurred in such a landscape. Travel across the desert would have required planning and knowledge, often following known routes between water sources. Encounters between groups may have been occasional rather than continuous. A group moving along a corridor might pass through an area, trade or interact briefly, and then continue. Another group might remain settled near an oasis, maintaining its own structure over generations. These different patterns of movement create different kinds of influence. Short-term contact can spread ideas and objects quickly, while long-term residence shapes ancestry more slowly. The result is a layered interaction where culture and biology do not change at the same speed. This helps explain why the Tarim mummies can appear connected in one sense and distinct in another. Their clothing, tools, and burial forms may reflect a world of contact, where useful practices moved across regions. At the same time, their DNA may preserve a deeper continuity that reflects long-term residence rather than constant mixing. This difference is not unusual, but it becomes more visible in places where the environment preserves both bodies and objects in detail. The desert does not create this pattern, but it allows us to see it more clearly. Another aspect of this filtering effect is uneven influence. Not all external contacts have the same impact. A single exchange or a small number of newcomers may influence daily life without significantly altering the overall genetic structure of a population. In contrast, repeated or large-scale movement can gradually reshape ancestry. In a region where movement is constrained, the first type of influence may be more common than the second. This leads to a situation where cultural signals can accumulate from different directions, while biological change remains more gradual and limited. Over time, this creates a population that reflects many connections on the surface, but maintains a deeper internal continuity. Time adds another layer to this process. If a population remains in such a filtered environment for many generations, the effects become more pronounced. Small differences can persist and become more visible when compared to surrounding regions that have changed in other ways. If nearby populations experience new migrations, shifts in settlement, or broader mixing, their genetic patterns may move in new directions. A population that remains more stable will then appear more distinct, not because it is separate from the human story, but because it has followed a different path within it. This may be part of what the genetic evidence is showing for the mummies. Their ancestry may not align with later patterns in the region, because those later patterns reflect additional layers of change that did not affect the Tarim population in the same way or at the same time. It is also important to recognize that isolation does not preserve everything equally. While some aspects of ancestry may remain stable, others may still change gradually. No population is completely unchanged over long periods. Genetic drift, small-scale mixing, and internal variation all continue to shape a community. What isolation can do is slow the rate of large-scale transformation, allowing older patterns to remain more visible than they would in more open regions. This is why the mummies can seem both familiar and unusual. They are human, shaped by the same processes as all populations, but their particular balance of contact and continuity makes their genetic pattern harder to place within the simplified map we often use. By seeing isolation as a filter rather than a wall, the story becomes clearer and more grounded. The Tarim Basin was not cut off from the world, but it shaped how the world could enter. Within that shaped space, a population could live, adapt, and persist, carrying forward an ancestry that later changes around it would make more difficult to recognize. When isolation is understood as a filter that shapes contact rather than removing it, the final step is to see how this filtered condition changes the way a population appears over time. What looks unusual in the present often comes from a difference in pace. Some regions experience rapid and repeated mixing, where new movements reshape the genetic landscape again and again. Other regions change more slowly, allowing older patterns to remain visible beneath the surface. The Tarim Basin may represent one of these slower regions, where the balance between contact and continuity allowed certain ancestral signals to persist longer than in surrounding areas. This does not create a separate kind of humanity, it creates a difference in timing. A population that changes more slowly will eventually look different when compared to regions that have changed more quickly. The difference is not in origin, but in the path taken through time. This helps explain why the mummies can feel difficult to place. Their DNA may reflect an earlier stage of population structure, one that was more common before later movements reshaped the wider region. As new groups entered neighboring areas and mixed with existing populations, the overall genetic pattern of Eurasia continued to shift. A community that remained more stable within the Tarim Basin would not follow that shift in the same way. Over many generations, this creates distance, not because the group is isolated in a complete sense, but because it is moving through history at a different speed. Cultural contact can still occur during this time. Objects, techniques, and practices can enter the region and become part of daily life. But these changes do not automatically alter the deeper structure of ancestry. This creates a layered identity. On the surface, the population may appear connected to wider networks. At a deeper level, it may retain patterns that are older and less affected by recent movements. This layering is difficult to recognize if we expect all aspects of a population to change together. In reality, human societies often carry different layers of history at once, some recent, some much older. The mummies make this visible because both the surface and the deeper layers have been preserved in unusual detail. Another important point is that what appears as difference today may once have been ordinary. The genetic pattern seen in the Tarim mummies may not have been unique at the time they lived. It may have been one of several patterns present across a wider area. As history moved forward, some of those patterns became more dominant, while others became less visible or disappeared through mixing. What we see now is shaped by survival. The populations that left clear descendants into the present define our expectations, while those that did not become harder to recognize. The mummies remind us that this perspective is limited. They show that there were ways of being human that do not map neatly onto the present-day structure of populations. This leads to a calmer understanding of the phrase, "does not match known populations." It is not a sign of something outside the human story. It is a sign that the story has missing pieces. The Tarim population may represent one of those pieces, preserved in a way that allows it to be studied, but not fully placed within the simplified categories we use. Their difference is not absolute. It is relative to what we can currently compare. As more ancient DNA is studied from different regions and time periods, these gaps may become smaller, or they may reveal even more complexity. Either way, the lesson remains the same. Human history is not a fixed map. It is a changing network, where populations move at different speeds, interact in different ways, and leave behind traces that are not evenly distributed. By the end of this stage, isolation is no longer seen as a simple cause of difference, but as part of a larger system that controls how change happens. The Tarim Basin becomes a place where that system can be observed more clearly. The mummies are not defined by isolation alone, but by the way isolation, contact, and time combine to shape a population that is both part of the human story and slightly out of alignment with the version of that story we see today. One of the most important lessons from the Tarim mummies is that culture and ancestry do not always move together. This may seem simple at first, but it changes how the evidence must be understood. When people see clothing, tools, burial objects, or building materials that resemble those from another region, it is easy to imagine a population moving from that region and bringing everything with it. Sometimes that does happen, Human groups have migrated, settled, mixed, and carried their practices across large distances. But this is not the only way culture travels. A useful technique can move from one group to another without the movement of a whole population. A weaving method can be learned. A tool design can be copied. A burial custom can be adapted. A way of handling animals, plants, wood, or fiber can pass through contact, exchange, observation, or marriage, without producing a strong genetic change in the community that receives it. This distinction is central to understanding why the mummies can appear connected to wider Eurasian patterns while still carrying a genetic signal that is difficult to match. Material culture is often more mobile than ancestry. An object can move in a single journey. A practice can spread from one settlement to the next. A style can become useful because it works well in a particular climate, not because it comes with a large group of new people. In a place like the Tarim Basin, where cold nights, dry winds, and difficult travel shape daily life, practical ideas would have mattered. If a garment form protected the body well, it could be adopted. If a wooden structure worked in burial conditions, it could be repeated. If a weaving technique made stronger or warmer fabric, it could become part of local life. None of this requires a complete replacement of the people who are already there. It only requires contact, and contact can happen in many forms. This helps explain why the archaeological record can feel mixed without requiring a simple migration story. The objects found with the bodies may suggest that the people of the basin were not cut off from surrounding worlds. They may have known, borrowed, adapted, or shared certain practices across distance. Yet the DNA can still suggest that their deeper ancestry remained more stable than the surface evidence would imply. This is not a contradiction. It is a normal part of human history. People are not sealed containers of culture and genes moving together in perfect alignment. A community can change how it dresses while keeping much of its ancestry. It can adopt a new technology while remaining biologically continuous. It can receive goods from distant areas without becoming genetically transformed by those areas. The Tarim mummies are powerful because they show how easily we can confuse visible contact with population origin. A textile that looks familiar may tell us about exchange, skill, or shared environmental problems. It does not, by itself, tell us where the person's ancestors came from. A burial object may point toward a connection with another region, but it cannot prove that the buried person belonged biologically to that region. This is why the evidence must be read in layers. The cultural layer shows what people used, made, borrowed, and valued. The biological layer shows inherited relationships. The environmental layer shows what the land allowed or forced. These layers overlap, but they do not always match perfectly. When we accept this, the mystery becomes calmer and more precise. The mummies are not strange because their objects and DNA seem to tell different stories. They are important because both stories may be true at the same time. Their community may have lived in a connected world, receiving ideas and materials from beyond the basin, while preserving an older ancestry that later populations no longer show clearly. This possibility keeps the title question from becoming a false exaggeration. Their DNA does not need to match every object around them. Their clothing does not need to prove their origin. Their burial customs do not need to name their population. Instead, each kind of evidence reveals a different dimension of life. And together they show that ancient identity was not a single line, but a quiet layering of inheritance, adaptation, and contact across time. If culture can move without large-scale genetic change, then the next question becomes how that movement actually happens in daily life. It is not enough to say that ideas travel. We need to understand the quiet mechanisms that allow this to occur without reshaping a population at its core. In a region like the Tarim Basin, these mechanisms would have been shaped by distance, environment, and the limited number of encounters between groups. Contact did not need to be constant or large to have an effect. Even brief interaction could introduce something new, especially if that new element solved a practical problem. A traveller passing through an oasis might carry a tool design, a weaving method, or a way of preparing materials that others had not used before. A small exchange between groups could lead to imitation. Over time, these small acts of learning accumulate, creating visible changes in material culture without requiring a corresponding shift in ancestry. One of the simplest ways this happens is through observation. People notice what works. If a neighbouring group has clothing that protects better against cold or wind, that design can be studied and adapted using local materials. If a method of constructing a burial structure holds up well in dry soil, it can be repeated. These forms of learning do not require deep integration between populations. They require attention, memory, and the ability to reproduce a useful idea. Another pathway is through exchange. Goods can move farther than people. A piece of cloth, a tool, or a crafted object may travel through several hands before reaching a new place. By the time it arrives, the people who made it may be far away, but the object itself becomes a model that can be copied. This creates a chain of influence that stretches across distance without moving entire communities. In such a system, material culture can appear connected across wide regions, while the populations themselves remain locally rooted. Marriage is another pathway, but it operates differently. When individuals from different groups form connections, they bring both cultural practices and genetic material. However, if such exchanges are limited in number, they may influence daily life more visibly than they alter the overall genetic structure. A few individuals can introduce new techniques or customs that spread through the community, while their genetic contribution becomes only one part of a larger and more stable pattern. Over many generations, this kind of contact can create a mixed cultural environment without producing a fully mixed population in genetic terms. This difference in scale is important. Culture can spread through repeated small interactions. Genes usually require sustained and widespread integration to shift a population significantly. In the Tarim Basin, where movement is shaped by difficult terrain and limited resources, it is likely that contact often occurred at a smaller scale. This would allow ideas and practices to move more freely than people. The result is a layered world where objects, techniques, and customs reflect a wider network, while ancestry reflects a more continuous local history. This helps explain why the mummies can show signs of connection without fitting neatly into a simple migration model. Their clothing and burial practices may carry traces of wider influence, while their DNA suggests a deeper continuity. The two are not in conflict. They are operating at different levels of human life. One responds quickly to need and opportunity. The other changes slowly across generations. When these levels are read together, they show a population that was neither isolated nor fully reshaped by external contact. Instead, it existed in a space where ideas could enter, be adapted, and become part of daily life, while the deeper structure of ancestry remained more stable. This understanding brings the story closer to the lived reality of ancient people. They were not defined by fixed boundaries or single origins. They were part of a world where learning, adaptation, and survival required openness to useful change, even as their communities remained rooted in place. The mummies, preserved in that environment, carry both sides of this process, the visible signs of connection and the quieter continuity of biological history that does not always follow the same path. When these different pathways of cultural movement are placed together, a clearer picture begins to form. Culture does not move as a single block carried by a single population. It moves in pieces. A tool can travel one way, a weaving technique can move another. A burial practice can spread slowly across generations, while a new material may arrive more quickly through exchange. Each of these elements follows its own path, shaped by usefulness, environment, and opportunity. In contrast, ancestry moves through people themselves, through birth and long-term residence. This difference creates a natural separation between what is visible in objects and what is carried in DNA. The Tarim mummies sit precisely within this separation. Their world appears connected because useful ideas and materials reach them, but their deeper biological pattern may reflect a slower and more continuous history. This does not require a contradiction. It reflects the normal way human societies function over time. In a demanding environment like the Tarim Basin, survival would have depended on adapting to conditions that did not change easily. Water remained scarce. Travel remained difficult. The cold and dry climate continued to shape daily life. Under these conditions, adopting effective practices from others would have been practical, even necessary. If a method worked, it would be used, regardless of where it came from. This creates a cultural surface that looks open and responsive. At the same time, the same environment would limit how many new people could enter and remain. Settlements would be tied to specific locations, especially oases, and those locations could not support unlimited growth. Movement into the region would be possible, but not constant or overwhelming. This allows a population to remain relatively stable in size and structure, even as it continues to interact with others. Over long periods, this balance produces a layered identity. On the surface, the population participates in a wider world. It uses tools, techniques, and materials that connect it to other regions. Beneath that surface, it maintains a continuity, shaped by long-term residence in a specific landscape. These two layers do not cancel each other. They coexist. When we look at the mummies, we are seeing both at once, which is why the evidence can feel difficult to interpret if we expect a single explanation. The clothing may suggest connection. The burial practices may show shared ideas. The DNA may point toward continuity. Each is correct within its own layer, but none alone can define the whole. This layered structure also explains why simple labels fail. To say that the mummies belong to one known group based on their material culture ignores the deeper biological evidence. To define them only through DNA ignores the visible signs of contact and adaptation. A careful understanding requires holding both together, without forcing them into alignment. This is not a weakness in the evidence. It is a reflection of how human life actually unfolds over time. People live in multiple systems at once: biological, cultural, environmental. These systems overlap, but they do not always change in the same direction or at the same speed. The Tarim mummies make this visible in a rare way, because both the surface and the deeper layers have been preserved. Their bodies carry the biological record. Their clothing and burial contexts carry the cultural record. The landscape carries the environmental constraints that shaped both. Together, these elements show that human identity is not a single line that can be traced easily from past to present. It is a combination of inheritance, adaptation, and interaction, each leaving different kinds of traces. By the end of this stage, the apparent contradiction between cultural connection and genetic distinction becomes more understandable. It is not a problem to be solved by choosing one explanation over the other. It is a pattern to be recognized. The mummies do not belong to a simple category because the past itself was not simple. They represent a community that lived within a network of exchange, while maintaining a continuity that later changes in the region would make harder to recognize. This understanding prepares the ground for the next step, where we begin to consider not just how these people were connected to others, but how modern ways of thinking about identity may influence how we interpret what we see. When we try to place ancient people into clear categories, we often bring modern expectations into a past that did not follow the same structure. Today, identity is often organized through nations, ethnic labels, languages, and borders that feel stable and well-defined. These categories are useful for understanding the present, but they are recent in the long span of human history. In the deeper past, especially in regions like the Tarim Basin, human groups did not exist within such fixed frameworks. Their identities were shaped more by immediate conditions, local relationships, and gradual changes over time. This creates a quiet problem when we look back at preserved remains. We expect to find a label that fits, a known group that matches, or a clear origin that can be named. When that does not happen, it can feel as if something is missing or unusual. In reality, what is missing may not be the past, but the way we are trying to describe it. The mummies from Western China highlight this gap. Their preserved bodies, material culture, and genetic signals provide real evidence, but none of these elements alone can be translated directly into a modern identity. The difficulty does not come from the people themselves. It comes from the limits of the categories we use to understand them. In archaeology and ancient DNA research, this problem appears as a challenge of classification. Scientists often compare ancient samples to known populations in order to describe relationships. But known populations are based on what has been studied, preserved, and recorded. They are not a complete list of all human groups that have ever existed. Many populations from the past have no clear representation in modern genetic data. Others are only partially visible through limited samples. When a new ancient group does not match these references, the result can seem surprising. But the surprise comes from the comparison, not from the existence of the group itself. The Tarim mummies may fall into this space where the available categories do not fully apply. Their ancestry may connect to older population structures that are not clearly represented in modern groups. Their cultural practices may reflect local adaptation combined with selective contact. Their physical preservation allows us to see them in unusual detail, which can make the lack of a clear label feel more noticeable. But the absence of a label is not evidence of something outside normal human variation. It is evidence that the framework of classification is incomplete. This is why careful language matters. To say that a population does not match known groups should not be understood as a final statement about who they were. It is a statement about the limits of current comparison. It means that within the data we have, their pattern is not easily placed. As more ancient DNA is studied and more archaeological sites are explored, these comparisons may become clearer, or they may reveal even more complexity. Either way, the process remains open. This perspective also changes how we think about identity itself. Identity in the ancient world was likely more fluid, shaped by daily life, environment, and relationships rather than fixed categories. A community could change its practices over time, interact with different neighbors, and still maintain a sense of continuity that is not easily visible to us now. What we see as separate elements, culture, ancestry, location, may have been experienced as a single lived reality. The mummies preserved in the desert show us fragments of that reality, but not the full structure behind it. By recognizing this, the question becomes more careful and more grounded. Instead of asking which modern group these people belong to, we begin to ask how they lived within their own time, and how their connections may have been different from the ones we expect today. This shift does not remove uncertainty. It places it in the right context. It allows the evidence to remain detailed without forcing it into a shape that belongs to a different era. The problem with labels becomes even clearer when we remember that every category is built from evidence that survived. A modern population can be sampled, named, compared, and placed on a map. An ancient population cannot speak for itself in the same way. It can only be approached through what remains: bones, graves, objects, landscapes, and sometimes DNA. Each of these traces gives information, but none gives a complete name. This is why the mummies of Western China must be handled with patience. Their bodies are visible, their clothing is preserved, and their genetic material can be compared, yet the full identity of the people cannot be recovered as if it were written on the body. We may be able to describe patterns of ancestry, material practice, and environmental adaptation, but those descriptions are not the same as knowing how the people understood themselves. This matters because the phrase, "no known population," can easily pull the mind toward the wrong kind of answer. It may sound as if scientists expected one clear match and found none, creating a dramatic absence. But in reality, ancient population comparison is more limited and more careful. A genetic sample can be close to some groups in certain ways, distant from others in other ways, and still not belong neatly to any modern category. This does not mean the population was unknowable. It means the available references do not fully contain the older structure of human diversity. The people represented by the mummies may have belonged to a population world that later changed so much that its original shape is no longer visible in a simple form. Modern labels can also make us think too sharply. They create edges where the past may have had gradients. One group here, another group there, a border between them, a clear line of descent from one to the next. But in ancient landscapes, especially around deserts, oases, and mountain corridors, boundaries may have been softer and more practical. A group might be connected to one neighbor through trade, another through marriage, another through shared roots, and another through older ancestry. These connections would not necessarily produce one clean identity. They would create overlapping relationships, some visible in objects, some in genes, some now lost entirely. If we force a modern label onto such a population, we risk flattening this complexity. We might mistake a cultural resemblance for a biological origin. We might mistake a genetic difference for complete isolation. We might assume that the absence of a modern match means the people were somehow separate from the rest of humanity. None of these conclusions would be careful. The better approach is to let each layer of evidence keep its own meaning. Clothing can show adaptation and contact. Burial patterns can show repeated practice. DNA can show inherited relationships. Geography can show why movement was limited or directed. Together, they help us understand the population without pretending to name it completely. This is also a lesson about humility in the study of human history. The past does not always arrange itself for our convenience. It does not always leave written records, clear descendants, or categories that match the present. Sometimes it leaves a body in dry ground, a woven garment, a burial structure, and a genetic pattern that does not fit the map we expected. That does not make the evidence weak. It makes the question more honest. The Tarim mummies remind us that ancient people should not be reduced to labels created long after they lived. They were not a puzzle piece waiting to be forced into a modern box. They were a real population shaped by place, time, ancestry, and contact. To understand them, we must accept that a careful description may be more truthful than a simple name. Their significance lies not in being impossible to classify, but in showing us that classification itself has limits when the human past is older, wider, and more layered than the categories we use today. As this careful approach to identity reaches its limit, what remains is a shift in how the question itself is asked. Instead of searching for a single name that can contain the mummies within a known category, the focus becomes broader and quieter. The question is no longer only who they were in terms of modern labels, but how they existed within the structure of human history at their own time. This shift matters because it removes the pressure to force the evidence into a fixed shape. It allows each layer environment, material culture, and DNA to remain meaningful without needing to agree perfectly with the others. In this way, the mummies are not a failure of classification. They are a reminder that classification is only one tool, and not always the most complete one. When we look at the preserved bodies, we see individuals who lived in a specific place, shaped by a landscape that required careful adaptation. When we examine their burial practices, we see repeated forms that suggest continuity and shared understanding within a community. When we consider their material world, we see signs of connection, where ideas and techniques could move across distance. And when we study their DNA, we see a pattern of ancestry that does not align simply with later populations. Each of these observations is stable on its own. The difficulty arises only when we try to compress them into a single identity that matches the categories we use today. This is where the idea of unknown must be handled carefully. Unknown does not mean unknowable. It means that the available evidence has not yet been fully connected, or that the categories we are using are not sufficient to describe what we see. In many cases, further research can refine the picture, adding more data points, more comparisons, and more context. But even with more information, the past may not resolve into a single clear label. It may remain layered, reflecting a population that existed within a different structure of identity than the one we recognize now. This realization also changes how we think about the role of discovery. The mummies are not important because they overturn everything we know. They are important because they show how much of human history still exists outside the most familiar patterns. They do not replace the broader story of migration and population change. They add depth to it, showing that alongside the large movements and well-known groups, there were also communities whose paths were quieter, more localized, and less visible in later history. These communities were not exceptions. They were part of the normal diversity of human life. By the time we reach this point, the central tension of the story becomes clearer. The mummies appear both connected and difficult to place, not because the evidence is contradictory, but because it reflects different aspects of human existence that do not always align in a simple way. Their environment explains their preservation. Their material culture suggests contact. Their DNA suggests continuity. Their identity, in the full sense, remains only partially visible. This is not a gap that needs to be closed quickly. It is a space that allows the evidence to remain honest. The past does not always give a final answer, and in many cases, a careful question is more valuable than a premature conclusion. The Tarim mummies invite this kind of question. They ask how a population can live within a connected world while maintaining a pattern of ancestry that does not match later expectations. They ask how much of human history has been shaped by groups that are no longer clearly visible in the present. And they remind us that understanding the past is not about fitting everything into what we already know, but about allowing what we find to reshape the limits of that knowledge in a gradual and careful way. When we return to the present, the question raised by these mummies begins to reflect something about how we think, not only about how they lived. The need to identify, to classify, and to place every group into a clear structure is not only a scientific habit, it is also a human tendency. We rely on categories to make sense of complexity. We expect that every population should have a name, a location, and a traceable path that leads from the past into the present. This expectation works well when the evidence is complete, when written records exist, and when populations have left clear descendants. But when the evidence is partial, as it often is in deep history, this expectation can create tension. The Tarim mummies sit precisely in that tension. They offer enough detail to invite classification, but not enough to fully satisfy it. This reveals something about the limits of our own thinking. The brain tends to prefer closure. It seeks patterns that can be completed, connections that can be named, and stories that can be resolved. When a pattern remains open, it can feel uncomfortable, even if the evidence itself is clear and consistent. This is why phrases like "does not match known populations" attract attention. They appear to describe a break in the system, a place where the expected order fails. In reality, the system has not failed. It is simply incomplete. The map we use to understand human populations is based on what has been preserved, studied, and compared. It is not a full record of all human history. When the mummies do not fit neatly into that map, they do not disrupt the past. They reveal the limits of the map itself. This is an important distinction, because it shifts the focus away from the idea that something unusual has appeared, and toward the idea that our understanding is still developing. The evidence remains grounded, the bodies are real, the archaeological patterns are consistent, the genetic data is carefully analysed. The uncertainty lies not in the existence of these people, but in the framework used to describe them. This is where the modern mind must adjust. Instead of asking for a final category, it must learn to hold multiple layers of evidence at once, even when they do not align perfectly. This is not a weakness. It is a more accurate way of reading the past. Human history is not a single line that can always be traced from one known group to another. It is a network with gaps, overlaps, and layers that do not always remain visible over time. Some populations leave strong and continuous traces. Others leave partial signals that become clearer only under specific conditions, such as the preservation seen in the Tarim Basin. The mummies show how easily we can confuse visibility with completeness. Because their bodies are well preserved, they appear more present than most ancient people. This presence creates the impression that we should be able to understand them fully. But preservation does not create knowledge by itself. It only provides material to study. The meaning of that material still depends on how it is interpreted, compared, and placed within a broader context. When that context is incomplete, the result will also remain open. By recognizing this, the question becomes more stable. It is no longer driven by the need to resolve a contradiction, but by the effort to understand how different forms of evidence relate to each other. The Tarim mummies do not require a dramatic explanation. They require a careful one. They remind us that the human past is larger than the categories we use, and that some parts of that past will remain only partially visible, even when the physical evidence is clear. When we begin to notice this tendency in ourselves, another layer of the question becomes visible. It is not only about the past, but about how the present shapes what we think the past should look like. We often expect that every group of people must fit into a clear line of descent, that each population can be placed into a familiar structure, and that uncertainty is something to be removed as quickly as possible. This expectation comes from living in a world where identity is often defined in stable terms. But the deeper we look into human history, the more we find that stability is not always the rule. Change, overlap, and partial continuity are just as common. The Tarim mummies bring this difference into focus because they sit at the edge of what our usual categories can handle. They are clear enough to study, yet not simple enough to label. This creates a moment where interpretation must slow down. Instead of moving quickly from observation to conclusion, it becomes necessary to hold the evidence in a more balanced way. The archaeological record shows a population living in a demanding environment, adapting to the desert, and maintaining certain practices over time. The material culture suggests that this population was not completely cut off from surrounding regions. The genetic evidence suggests a pattern of ancestry that does not align neatly with later populations. Each of these statements can be true at the same time, but they do not combine into a single easy description. This is where the modern habit of simplifying can lead to misunderstanding. If we focus only on the cultural evidence, we may assume a direct connection to a known group. If we focus only on the genetic evidence, we may imagine a population that is more separate than it actually was. The more careful approach is to recognize that both layers describe different aspects of the same reality. The difficulty lies not in the evidence, but in the expectation that it should form a single answer. This expectation can also affect how information is communicated. When a complex result is reduced to a simple phrase, it can lose its original meaning. A statement that a population does not match known groups may be intended as a careful description of current data, but it can be heard as something more absolute. This shift in meaning can create a sense of mystery that goes beyond what the evidence supports. The mummies then become part of a story that feels unusual, not because they are outside human history, but because the language used to describe them has been simplified. Returning to a slower and more precise way of thinking helps bring the focus back to what can be known. The mummies represent a population that lived within a specific landscape, adapted to its conditions, interacted with other groups in limited ways, and carried an ancestry that reflects a deeper layer of human history. None of this requires a dramatic explanation. It requires patience. It requires accepting that some questions remain open, not because they cannot be answered, but because the available evidence does not yet allow a complete reconstruction. This way of thinking also changes how we see uncertainty. Instead of treating it as a problem to be removed, it becomes part of the process of understanding. In scientific work, uncertainty is not a failure. It is a sign that the limits of current knowledge have been reached, and that further work may expand those limits over time. The Tarim mummies illustrate this clearly. They show how a well-preserved set of remains can still lead to open questions when the broader context is incomplete. They also show how careful interpretation can keep those questions grounded without turning them into unsupported claims. By the end of this stage, the focus has shifted again. The question is no longer only about the mummies themselves, but about how we read evidence, how we build categories, and how we respond when the past does not fit the structure we expect. This prepares the way for a final reflection, where the value of the discovery is not in providing a simple answer, but in showing how much of human history still remains partially hidden, waiting to be understood through a balance of evidence and careful thought. By the time we reach this point, the question has changed in a quiet but important way. It no longer asks for a single origin or a final label. Instead, it asks how we should understand a past that does not always fit into the structures we use today. The mummies from the Tarim Basin do not resist explanation because they are outside human history. They resist simple explanation because human history itself is more layered than our categories allow. When the evidence is placed together, environment, material culture, and DNA, it does not collapse into one answer. It remains distributed across different levels, each one clear on its own but not fully aligned with the others. This is not a contradiction. It is a reflection of how human life unfolds over time. The desert preserved bodies and objects with unusual clarity, but it did not preserve every connection that would make interpretation complete. The archaeological record shows continuity in practice, but not a full map of origin. The genetic data shows relationships, but not a name that fits modern expectations. Together, they form a picture that is stable but open. This openness is not a gap to be closed quickly. It is a condition that allows the evidence to remain honest. If we force a conclusion too early, we risk turning a careful question into a simplified story. If we allow the question to remain, we can see more clearly what each part of the evidence is actually showing. The mummies become important not because they provide a final answer, but because they hold multiple kinds of information at once. They show how a population can live within a connected world, adapt to a difficult environment, and carry an ancestry that does not match the most familiar patterns. This combination is not rare in deep history. It is simply rare for it to be preserved in a way that we can observe so clearly. Another part of this reflection is the role of time. What appears unusual now may have been ordinary in the past. The genetic pattern seen in these mummies may represent a layer of human diversity that was once more widespread. Over time, later movements, mixing, and changes in population structure may have reduced the visibility of that layer. What remains today is shaped by survival, not by completeness. The populations that are easy to recognize now are not the only ones that existed. The mummies remind us that other patterns once existed alongside them, even if those patterns are no longer clearly visible in the present. This changes the meaning of the discovery. It is not about finding something that does not belong. It is about recognizing that the map we use to understand human populations is still incomplete. Each new piece of evidence does not simply fill a gap. It can also show that the shape of the map itself needs to be adjusted. The Tarim mummies are one such piece. They do not overturn the broader understanding of human migration and connection, but they show that the details within that understanding are more complex than a single model can describe. By the end of this stage, the question has become more stable and more grounded. It no longer depends on the idea of mystery as something dramatic. It rests on the recognition that human history contains many layers, some of which remain only partially visible. The mummies are part of those layers. They do not need to be explained as something separate or extraordinary. They can be understood as a population that lived, adapted, and left behind a record that now helps us see the limits of our own knowledge. This prepares the final step of the story, where the value of the discovery is not in resolving every detail, but in showing how careful, patient interpretation can turn uncertainty into a deeper and more useful understanding of the human past.